transcends the district itself. I think that was
better now.
I think that was an element of it. But even at that, I've heard that the folks up around you didn't vote for it either. So it's like, well, if you're not,
That was one of the main tenets.
yeah, if you're not gonna vote for replacement of your own school, so that's just
Well,
Rick Nielsen's really convinced.
so here's another thing I learned from our failure in 2017. By running the election in the general election, we have a heck of a lot more support.
Yeah,
So you pick up the apathy vote. It used to be have a special election, rally the
correct.
proponents, and it'll overwhelm the opposition. And because of social media, that's not the case.
I would
There's
agree.
an apathy vote that doesn't play into special elections. And I think anyone that runs an election outside of a general election is making a mistake.
And we're probably running one next year.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Why two? As our survey indicated the same thing.
You get a lot more turnout, and I think generally people are more supportive.
Correct.
I know.
But they aren't motivated enough
All right.
to get out.
I
Come
I
get
think
money. Rich,
we're at the point where we've hit critical mass. We have 50% of VAs either online or here in the room. And so that's a good enough count to have this conversation today. So I appreciate your time. I'm assuming you can hear me, because I don't know how to control the system in this room. If you can't hear me talking right at the moment, send a text to me or Rich or Steph or Janet, sorry, Zane, and say we can't hear you, but I'll assume that you can hear us. And hopefully, if you're also connected with video, you'll be able to see the documents we're going to walk through. I did send out the documents in an email, so hopefully you have a copy of those. And we'll get ourselves started here. We have Rick Nielsen, superintendent from Nebo School District. He did a great presentation to the superintendents last week, and I'm grateful that he's here to make that same or similar presentation to the business administrators today. And then after his introduction, I'll jump right into the spreadsheets and documents, and we'll start talking through the proposal.
Thanks, Todd. Good to be with you. I walked into the superintendent meeting early a week ago, and there were Todd and Terry sitting there, and I said, oh, my prayers have been answered. I said, there's no way to have this conversation without Todd Hopper to have the conversation. And I felt that way among my superintendent peers. Clearly, Todd's critical for a business administrator conversation. So really, I primarily said I was willing to come for a couple of reasons. First, well, three reasons. I like my business administrator peers, so it's good to be with you. But really, to sidekick with Todd, I'm so grateful for him that he came, and I wanted to repay the debt and make sure that I came as he led a discussion with his peers. And then lastly, Terry Shoemaker's out of town. And so this is such a complex issue for those of us that have been involved in the conversation. I just think it's inherently unfair to just have one person that's listened to the conversation have to try to process all of the questions that might be asked, or even all of the comments that might need to be made. So I said to Janet when we first walked in, it dawned on me driving up here that probably today with Todd and I'm Al Michaels and he's Troy Aikman. Right? I've never played the business administrator game, so I know enough about what's going on to comment on what's happening. But you really got to have the color guy next to the play-by-play guy to really explain what's going on. And so that's really all I'm here to do, is just be support more than anything. So just a couple of things that Terry mentioned, and then I added in as well, that might just be helpful for everybody to have in the back of your mind before Todd jumps in. The first thing that Terry, I think, made a big point of emphasis on, that he can say more articulately than I can, but those who have been in their roles longer than a decade will remember that there are downturns actually in the economy, right? We have a lot of superintendents. I mean, I'm in my 10th year and I got hired, I got hired in 2010. So really the dip had happened before that, and then we were starting to climb out of it, right? But I had been the assistant superintendent, so I knew something about our $4.5 million cliff that got created in Nebo School District, and that I worked with Tracy to lead us out of that to start with, Tracy and Michael, and then of course it's been much better in the decade since then. But I think that's an important thing for maybe those who have been in their roles, business administrators, board members, and superintendents, less than a decade, to be mindful of the fact that education isn't always on a positive revenue stream. There's times when we have ups and downs. So that's something that Terry felt was really important. Here's something that what I shared with superintendents that I just think sets the stage for why we're having a conversation today. I'll take you back to our USBA delegate assembly. So you think of our little brochure that we give out, and I just pulled these statements straight off of that brochure. Okay, continue fundamental obligations and commitments. And then under that it says, fully fund student enrollment growth, including line item categories. So that's something we value. And we all know that every year we're going back and having that as an ask, right? But that is a priority to us to fully fund student enrollment growth. Under a heading, enact policy requests, we state to create greater property tax equity and expand educational opportunity through new property tax revenues. So that's our statement out of delegate assembly on our brochure. And then under that, we make 5 statements, but here's 3 of them. We support the Utah Constitution that designates income tax as a dedicated revenue stream to fund public and higher ed. We are prepared and willing to work cooperatively with the legislature to work solutions to solve the state's structural tax imbalance through a fair and comprehensive review. And a third bullet is it says modify the calculation of the certified tax rate to include an automatic inflation adjustment. So again, those are our statements, those are our priorities, those are the things we have interest in as collective bodies from UASBO, USBA, and USSA. Then I reminded the superintendents of the USBE position statements that were just declared, what was it, maybe a week and a half ago or something like that. And I don't need to read those to you. It talks about maintaining stability, increasing the investment in education, accounting for variations in districts' ability to raise local revenue, and maintaining a constitutional guarantee for education funding. And I think those are all things that we agree with. We might have differences of opinion on how those ought to be worded, just like there might be differences of opinion on the talking points document on how the guiding principles could be worded. But fundamentally, those are foundational principles that we've had in mind. So that's just a quick lead in to what I'll call legislative background. So if you think about what our goals are and our priorities are and our asks are, if you will, we found ourselves in a position, USBA leadership, USSA leadership. I applaud Terry because when he was working with legislative leadership on getting some people at the table, he said, we have got to have UASBO at the table. We can't sit there with USSA and USBA and not have a business administrator perspective. And of course, Todd is your legislative liaison. So kudos to Terry for pointing out the importance of having Todd there. And kudos to Todd for making the time to be there and representing UASBO and frankly, all of us from a dollars and cents perspective, a spreadsheet perspective. So you had, I think, well, you had 2 to 4 superintendents there. Jerry Holmes and I were there as superintendents, but then Senator Milner had invited, because we're on leadership, Senator Milner had invited Jeff Stevens and Reed Newey to come in, because that's the area she represents. So they were there and good voices. You had Mary Nielsen there, McKay Jensen, Rick Ainge was in and out. And then you had Scott Jones there from USBE. So that's kind of the team that got invited to come in. And here was the invite, though, to participate in discussions and provide feedback on a tax policy idea. We didn't bring the idea to the table. This wasn't something that your leadership generated and thought of and said, oh, hey, we've got this thing. Let's go see if we can find a bill sponsor and see if we can get somebody to run with this, okay? From what I can gather, this was Senate leadership, House leadership, working with Senator Milner to potentially be a bill sponsor on this. And it might have been that it's the opposite, that Senator Milner had the idea, I don't know. But fundamentally, they had this idea to look at some things with property tax rates, property tax revenue. But I applaud them because right out of the gate, they said, you know what, we want to be focused on increasing funding for public education. And what we said is, this has to be real increases. This can't be, 10 more kids moved in. Because 10 more kids moved in, we increased funding. Okay? It's like, no, this has to be, because you all know better than me, the funding for public ed has fundamentally been flat for 30 years. So that's what we kept saying is, that line that's been flat for 30 years, it needs to have a positive trajectory. Whatever plan we're going to give feedback on has to have a positive trajectory on actually increasing funding for education. They wanted to establish greater stability in public education funding. Right now, all of the funding has come out of income tax. They were saying, how can we have more of a diversified portfolio? Is really a thought they had to start with. They were interested in increasing local flexibility. So they said, how can we make it so that local school districts, local LEAs can have more flexibility? And then a clear tenet, and I would say this is most likely out of the Senate, but the House buys off on it as well. But we know we've had bills in the past from Senator Fillmore and Senator Osmond that were focused on equalization. And from everything I can gather, the Senate was just saying, hey, listen, if this is going to have a hearing in the Senate, it has to have an equalization component. So that's fundamentally what they brought in and put in front of us. And we have been through, I don't know how many iterations of what their original ideas are. And I'll give legislative fiscal analysts and our elected officials full credit. They truly brought us in to listen to our ideas. Again, it was on that very targeted and very focused package. They didn't come in and say to us, you know, have you got another alternative on tax reform? Okay, so that's the other thing I want to be really clear on. It wasn't them asking us for tax reform suggestions. It was them saying to us, we have an idea that meets some of these principles. As you can already tell, a lot of those principles, in some regards, really are in alignment with what our guiding principles are as well. Now, whether you like the idea for meeting our guiding principles is why we're having meetings, right? But they brought us some ideas. They've solicited our feedback. They've been very open to the conversations. They've made adjustments based on what we've said. They've made adjustments based on what House and Senate leadership has given them. And so really we got to the point where the talking points document you have, and Todd will take primarily the lead from now moving on, but really we got to the point of, okay, this is as good as we can get it, given what the rules of the game were and given their ability, their willingness to listen. And this was the best. I don't like the word negotiated because it wasn't negotiation. It was more collaboration. This was the best collaborative response we could come up with. And we just got to the point where we said, it's time to unroll this with legislators on a broader scale. It's time to enroll this with superintendents, business administrators, school boards, so that we can have conversation on it. And I would hope we don't come across as salesmen. Okay, our objective is to teach and to train and to facilitate conversation on this best idea that we can come up with. And we'll just have to decide collectively as our bodies how we're going to move forward on this moving forward from now. But I don't imagine there's tremendous amount of wiggle room at this point, even on this proposal. And again, this is outside of giving suggestions on how tax reform could be better handled. This is strictly targeted on how education funding fits into the tax reform conversation. That summarize it okay, Todd?
It's
Is that
awesome.
a good lead in? All
All
right.
done. Okay, we can go home now.
Oh, good. Yeah. Go home now, other than all of the spreadsheets and all of the.
Oh, that's all, details that are unnecessary. I'd like to recognize Representative Briscoe joining us here today. Thank you for your attention to this as we talk through.
I am not reporting to anyone.
You're here to
Just heard, I just want to listen more.
Excellent. Thank you. So the presentation was made last Thursday to superintendents with the idea that they would be informed well enough to have a conversation with their local school boards to solicit feedback. By the time we got to the end of the meeting, it was apparent to them that they really wanted the BAs to be on the same page and be able to answer the questions that they couldn't, or to understand it in the dimensions that they may not understand. And so we have this very exciting meeting today that we called in short order so that we can get you up to speed with what the proposal is, so that between you and your superintendents, you can have a conversation with your school board with the intent to solicit feedback. Again, this is a proposal. It's not locked into anything. This is just what do we feel about it? How do we see it? How do we perceive it? Could it be better? Does it have some blind spots to it? Does it have some negative effects that might be unintended consequences? So as I talk through this, kind of think in that context is, how is this working? If I had to explain it to my board member, do I have the wherewithal to be able to explain it to them so that they can intelligently respond back and say, we like this feature of it. We don't like this feature. What if it did this? Is it possible to have these other ideas incorporated? So think in those terms, but how can we have that conversation in order to facilitate feedback? Because it very much, as I understand it, we're in a feedback loop. Hey, this is an idea. How does it work?
So it may be tweaked based on feedback.
I'm sure it will be tweaked by all kinds of interested parties that are seeing this now. So this was a uniform talking document for us to have with our bodies and for the legislative leadership to have with its bodies. So, we wanted to have the same pieces of information so that the conversation was at least coherent that way. And there wasn't opinions. It's like, no, here are the talking points. I'm suspecting that there'll be all kinds of feedback from all quarters. We can be able to facilitate our conversations intelligently so we give feedback as well. So with that in mind, let's pull out our sheets. Now, there were two that went out. There was an earlier document that was sent out. It has since been revised. So hopefully you received an email from Clerk Jolly that has the revisions to it. It didn't substantially change anything. It just added some more bullet points to be more clear. And it changed some numbers on the table that we had caught were not quite right. So let's go with the top of the page. The reason that we were pulled together was to find a method that would support. Do you want to see that?
No, I'm just worried I'm in the way. I don't know how
It's
ability
not
to.
there. You're good. So the idea is to provide stabilization, enhancement, and equalization to public education funding in replacement to the constitutional provision that's in place now that income tax goes into the education fund for education purposes. So that's a bigger context. It's not just how do we improve education funding on its own. It's in context of we have statutory provision. And the reason for that is that leadership sees that constitutional provision is preventing their flexibility to respond to the funding needs of the state, including public education. Rick already talked about in economic downturns, the legislative ability to respond to that downturn was hampered because it was only going to come from a certain revenue source that was shrinking at that time. And so there's a benefit to education as well, that flexibility should be in place because there are economic downturns and there are economic upswings. And how can we manage that to the benefit of public education? If you look on the chart, you'll see, or if you look on the page, you'll see a chart that is figure number 1. This chart is to help illustrate that idea that there have been economic downturns and public education they weren't immune to those economic downturns. At the same time, as we all know as business administrators, there's also been economic upswings, and not all of the dollars made it into public education in those years either. This chart is designed to show on the x-axis, it represents the incremental changes in revenue. So these are new dollars coming into the state through the income tax. And then the y-axis is how much change was there in the appropriation for that same year. So as you plot that, if there was an expectation that every dollar that came into the state made its way into public education, you would have a 45-degree line through the chart, because every dollar in would be a dollar appropriated. This shows that that does not happen. And the constitutional guarantee, if you want to call it that, or the constitutional provision, doesn't guarantee that that will happen. It doesn't say that every dollar that comes in will go to public education. It does say that every dollar that comes in will go to an education purpose, but it doesn't make it to public ed. So this chart is just showing or illustrating that if you think there's a guarantee, there isn't.
We know where it's going.
You bet. So when I explained this to my board Tuesday night, they asked that very question. They said, well, where does it go? So we know the biggest area that the money went into is that in '96, higher ed was brought into the Constitution of those dollars. So that's the biggest piece of money that we know. So it's an income tax dollar that came in. This is a public education chart, not an education chart. So that's your biggest one. There's also, when there are years of surplus, there's a statutory provision that a percentage of that will go into the rainy day fund. It's not a generic rainy day fund. There's one for general ed or general fund, thank you. And there's one for education fund. So again, it's still an education purpose. It's a rainy day fund, but it will come to education. So those are your two big buckets. The executive approach received a report on Tuesday night, and I believe the number was just a little above 650 million, somewhere in that range. Yeah, you can go out on the website, you just look at the fiscal report from Tuesday night, they have all the fund balance information.
And don't they also take that money and build buildings that have nothing to do with education?
Not out of the rainy day fund.
Not out of the rainy. I'm talking about out of the surplus.
So the surplus still has its designation as an income tax, which is protected under the Constitution to be for educational purposes. So it might be a higher ed physical facility, but it won't be a human services building. It won't be a public safety vehicle. It won't be a state government building. It will stay in the education purpose, because that's what the Constitution does protect. Is if it comes in that way, it will be for an educational purpose. The other areas that it goes is unappropriated in the education fund. So for example, this last legislative session, $75 million was not appropriated to higher ed or public ed. It's sat as a fund balance. This is Todd's editorial comment here, so don't necessarily take this to your boards. But if you look at the task force recommended bill, if you add up their dollars, it looks like it's going to be a tax reduction of like $79 million. Well, they kind of parked 75 million already from the last legislative session that could offset that. So it's actually a tax neutral. It really is a tax neutral proposition in that sense. So things like that happen. It just goes unappropriated in the year it was collected. Again, it doesn't disappear into some other government purpose. it will make its way into a public or a education purpose at some time in the future. And you just never know when it is.
So Todd, that 75 million could have been available for WPU increases. It wasn't one-time money, it was ongoing.
It could have gone to higher ed. It could, yeah, again, it's in that world of education purpose. It could have gone a number of places. And it, just for sake of clarity, the constitutional guarantee does not protect the purpose statement from tax reductions. So those are independent decisions the legislature has always had the ability to make. So, you know, so that's a dollar that never made it in. So it's a dollar you can't count on. If it's going to be collected, it's going to make it in. And now the constitutional provision's in place. So don't get confused in that world. You know, if someone thinks that there might be something, well, no, it actually has to show up to have the constitutional provision in place to protect it.
But that is an important point of clarification, that there's nothing constitutional at all about the income tax rate.
Correct. It's just once it's collected, it has
Correct.
its constitutional purpose.
Just one more comment with regards to the graph. I know the point of the graph is to show how it varies, and it's not necessarily protected, but from a historic standpoint, if you look back in time, I think the times where we actually were hurt by the ups and downs and what's going on with there are, in my tenure as a BA, when I first came on, the WPU had not been increased for like 3 years.
Mhm.
That was back in '88.
Mhm.
And until the recession of 2010, that WPU had never been frozen. And so in my mind, yeah, we've had these ups and downs, but really we have never had to freeze the WPU except twice that I'm aware of in over 30 years.
Great, and that's a great lead into this next chart. So this is figure 2. So if you have your documents in front of you, we're looking at figure 2 now. And this was also an attempt to illustrate what Zane's describing. Because if you look back in time, how has the income tax fluctuations impacted public education, and how impactful has appropriations to public education been over that same time period? So if you look at this chart, look at the blue dashed line, that's taking increases to public education on a real basis. So this is an inflationary adjusted appropriations and what it looks like. And you can see through here that in 2007 and 8, there was a big spike. In 2001, 2002, just before that smaller recession, there was an uptick in revenues. And then you can see in 2010, 11, the reaction, or that you're in the recession now. Those fluctuations are what leadership was looking at trying to smooth out. That is there a way to put public education on a funding trajectory that doesn't respond so radically to those changes? Can we smooth this thing out? It also illustrated on this, as you can see, kind of what Zane is saying is that line, that dashed line, is pretty flat. So on a real basis, even though there's been great efforts to fund public education, on a real basis, we're not really getting ahead in the game. And leadership recognizes that as well. So they want to put forward a proposal that will enhance public education in the future, not just provide stability and keep it on a flat trajectory, but actually how do we grow this thing? How do we really address the needs of public education? So that's what your blue dashed line is. That's where we are or have been. And then if you look at the brown dashed line, in our meetings, we pushed back a little bit and said, hey, you're right. You know, we've been living this. We know that on a real basis that public education funding hasn't been helping us move forward in time. And if you look at the gap between the years before the spike and look at the gap on the years on the backside, so the dash blue to the dash brown, our local governments, our local school boards have been making up for the fact that it has only been growing at less than inflation. We had real things to do. We had payrolls to make, we had expenses to cover, we had children to educate. Local boards were raising revenues on their own to fund the need that we knew was in public education. Legislature was just kind of barely holding level, and we were independently having to make those decisions. So that's what the brown line to me illustrates is we've been there. We've been doing this with property tax dollars already. It's been on our backs.
That flies against what the majority leader says in the paper today on Utah policy, where he claims that the state is putting in more money in the local school boards.
And that is an accurate statement. When you look at the ratio between income tax dollars appropriated to public ed and the property tax dollars, that has moved from a 75-25% ratio to a 10 or 90-10 ratio. So there has been more dollars coming in from appropriation from income taxes, and it has eclipsed how much is coming from property tax.
The difference between the blue and the upper line is what was added by local school boards.
It is, yeah, on a real revenue basis, that's what's
And
happening.
the gap is greater in 2020 than it was in 1998.
99, yeah, yes, sir.
Why do they throw capital into this discussion? In my mind, it should be totally aside, because we can't use that money and
For operational.
raise, and if they open that door, I think it's a big mistake.
So I think there's two things. One is that we're looking to be able to enhance funding to public education, which includes all funding, not just operational, but we all have capital needs, and those costs escalate on an inflationary basis as well. So is there a way to bring that into the conversation? And two, if we're already going to index a couple, well, we haven't talked about indexing yet, but if we're going to index a couple of the levies, this one should be indexed as well. Why would it be left out if we're trying to provide that enhancement and get it on an
We
index?
aren't talking about taking
No.
the walls down necessarily on
No,
what can be
We'll,
used for
we'll
what.
talk about a cap combo, but the cap does not change purpose. It's really a revenue game, and it's not a purpose game. And we can get into that in a minute. The solid lines, so the solid blue and then the respective solid brown line, that's if you took this proposal and had implemented it back in 1998. What would it have done? Would this proposal have accomplished the stability goal? And would it accomplish the enhancement goal? Because there's no point in talking about this if it's not even going to meet some of our expectations and purposes. So that's what you see here. So you can see the blue line represents a smoothed out funding mechanism. You didn't get the peak in 2007, 2008, but you also didn't get the trough in 10 and 11. It also took it above the real return to a higher funding position, or it would have. Sorry, I got to make sure this is all would have stuff. So there's some promise that this type of tool could accomplish those goals. It could smooth it out, and it could have us enhanced above just.
And then the brown line shows what could have been, if you will,
And it shows
state and local.
correct. And it also shows the greater enhancement. We'll flip over the page here in just a second, but it'll show a greater enhancement that's coming from property tax by indexing. So it's not just that there's more state dollars coming into this, it's that there is more property tax coming into this equation as well. And that's the enhancement concept.
So in this chart, you've gone backwards and looked to see what the result would have been, could have been.
Could have been.
Have we looked into the future 25 years? My concern is in 96, when the Constitution by law was changed, the state was flush with money and nobody had any issues with spending education fund dollars on higher ed. Nobody foresaw the pipeline between the general fund and the education
So
fund
policy
and all of that. Moving forward 25 years from now, have we looked at what the property tax, individual property tax rates would look like? And based upon the discussion that I overheard as I walked in this morning, how that would seriously impact the ability of school districts to bond, because the property tax rates go up every year, compounding pretty soon. I mean, taxpayers are gonna see a property tax increase every year, even though it's not legally stated as such. And in 25 years, is anybody gonna be able to pass the bond? We only got 2 out of 6 this last go
Sure.
around. Is anybody gonna be able to pass the bond in 25 years?
Excellent. So I got 2 responses. The first one is, this is an economic view, not a policy view. So the changes in the Constitution and the changes on tax reform, those are policy decisions that you cannot forecast. We have no idea what those decisions will be. So we didn't try to model what if there was some substantial fundamental change. This is just an economic forecast. Hey, revenues were increasing on this basis. In this case, it's a chain CPI calculation. What would it look like? Just strictly economic, devoid of policy. I don't know how to answer the policy. Are there safeguards against policy decisions in the future? I don't know that that's even attainable. Might be a worthy goal. I don't know if we can get there. Legislature should have the ability to make decisions. They under the Constitution, hold the purse. That's their responsibility under the Constitution is to manage these fundings, and they will do it according to their will. The second question, I think, is a strong feedback piece that we need to get out there is that, hey, our tax-paying public has only so much appetite to pay taxes. And if there's a non-discretionary piece, which this would be, this was going to be on autopilot, and we have a discretionary discussion, which is we need to raise taxes for our local needs, there's going to be a conflict. And at some point, we're going to hit into a tolerance, or the end of a tolerance range. I don't know where that is for each community. It might already be in existence for many of us before we even talk, and others, we might be really close to it. So again, Rich, I think that's going to be a really good feedback piece, is how can we manage that reality that at the end of the day, it's the taxpayers going to pay this, and they'll tell us when they're done. And we don't want to find out in the middle of a bond proposition that they're done.
Well, and I think some board members, at least some of ours, have expressed concern that it might be a 4-year thing and you're done as far as board goes, or you're going to get board members running on a platform. We won't raise tax. And just this, I think it has some danger.
Great. Good to know. Again, let's try and capture all these thoughts and concerns. If you want to write them down and ship them in to me, great. Representative, yes.
Todd, my understanding was they created that line based on current levied voted board capital outlay as currently levied by boards.
Correct.
But what if that line could change theoretically if boards decided to increase their board levy if they had caps, if they hadn't reached caps?
Correct.
There's room for them to move.
There is.
Would they be restricted from making those?
No. So this concept is an add-on to what you already have. So the index will not impact caps. The
They
current
may not want to if they saw this coming and they felt it was sufficient. My understanding.
Yeah. So the ability for legislators to manage things down the line is complicated. And some of what we're talking about today is stuff so complicated, you would never actually see it in a constitutional statement, because constitutional is a broader stroke. It's not the nitty gritty. That's why you have legislation, is to help accomplish the purposes stated in a constitution. So yes, locals can do things. The intent is that the indexing is above and beyond the caps. The caps do not, Richard's comment is more apropos, because that's our community has their own cap. It might be undisclosed, but there's a point where they will not pay more. It doesn't matter what it says in the statute. That's what we're more worried about, is how do we hit that unknown threshold?
But the amount of money that's generated is going to be based on your tax rate. So that if you're a Park City and you're contributing and you increase your tax rate, that's going to put more in the pool.
Let's get to the equalization conversation, and we can get deeper into that, because I got all kinds of comments on that.
Just real quick to piggyback on Rich, is I've heard statements from legislators that it's a revenue neutral, and that local boards may be increasing their taxes, but will lower the income taxes. So overall, it's kind of a revenue neutral proposal. But I don't think the constituents in our worlds combine those. They don't think, oh, well, I saved money on income tax, so the local school board raising taxes, that's okay. Sure. They're completely mutually exclusive in most of our constituents' eyes, because one body controls income tax, the other body controls property tax. So I hope they understand that concept, that from the state level perspective, that might make sense, but on our local level, I don't see that's a hard sell.
Yeah, and I would suggest that there might be two different ideas competing in that statement. This proposal is absolutely about enhancing public education funding. This is about new dollars, more dollars, income tax dollars and property tax. This is more. There is no offset. This is more. In the broader discussion of tax reform, there is a goal, which is to have whatever provisions they're going to change will have a net neutral effect on the state. It will not generate more revenue for the state. So that, I don't know how this piece fits into that bigger context. Whether this, we're saying it's going to be more money, does that mean that legislators will feel more inclined to reduce the income tax rate in order to make the whole proposition tax neutral? I don't know. This one's really kind of very narrow. It's saying our goal is enhanced, stable, and then we'll get into utilization here in a minute. So it is more money. This is intended to generate more money.
So I'm not trying to hijack the meeting, but three comments.
Go for
or
it.
questions. With Tim's comment, the initial implementation of this, income tax go down, property tax up, sales tax up. Let's say that's revenue neutral. Property taxes are going to continue to escalate. My question is, has there been any discussion of a continuing decrease in the sales or in the income tax to offset that? Probably not.
Not that I'm aware of.
So then essentially then the state is increasing their revenue on the back of the property taxpayers because the sales tax, the income tax would stay stable. And part of that then is as property tax increases, what guarantees or what assurances do we have that the level of state funding will not decrease proportionally?
Yep.
And so that's to me, that's a huge concern. And, we see that in this, right? And then third, in the future, back to my original comment, as property tax rates increase, there's going to be less and less of an appetite for supporting bond elections, which is going to force, especially those growing school districts, to use alternative methods of bonding, at least revenue bonds, which is going to increase costs for the school districts.
Sure.
So, at some point, that is going to be a reality.
Yep. And
so now that's another increased cost for education because of this property tax scheme that flagged for Scove's proposal.
You're good. So hold on to those thoughts. Let's flip the page over. And let's talk about the elements of the plan to see if the concerns Richard raises are ameliorated by some of the strategy that's in here. I don't know about your number 3 point. I think there's some unintended consequences that we will need to articulate. So I'm going to take you to the table first and just talk about the 4 lines that you see there. So the first line is called local, meaning property tax, that the voted board and capital would be allowed to grow by an indexed CPI. The particular CPI that has been chosen is called the chained CPI. I'll ask this group, are you familiar with what chained CPI is?
Something that brings down whatever the CPI was.
That's the end result, but I'll explain the mechanism and then you can get to the real truth of what Zane just said. I didn't say it.
Yeah.
So the CPI is based on a basket of goods in different geographic or regional areas, and then it's composited into a single number for the nation. It's assumed that as the price of, let's say you're buying bananas, if the price of bananas goes up, that affects the index, and so you have your inflationary factor based on those items increasing in cost. A consumer, however, may not buy that same item at the higher price. They may decide that the bananas are too expensive, I'm going to buy an apple instead. And so the chain CPI then is following that kind of behavior, that purchasing pattern of the consumer, which has the effect that Zane described, which is it actually dampens the effects both up and down on CPI, on inflationary measures. So that's what this is looking at. This is saying, let's smooth out even the CPI. Because if we're looking for stable, we don't want this thing bouncing around because inflationary numbers are bouncing around. Let's get something smoothed out. It does come at the cost of, it cuts the tops off and it cuts the bottoms off as well. And that's the compromise there. Wait, we weren't negotiating. So that's the effect there. That's not the compromise. Get in my vocabulary straight here. So, and it's as Janet described, it's applied to those levies, but it's actually tagging into your assessed valuations. So you might have some rate, but it's looking at your assessed valuations and applying the CPI against the assessed valuations to generate more revenue.
So
Yes.
maybe you'll get to this, Todd, but for us, our voted is totally equalized, so.
So this is,
just less state revenue coming in.
so this is, think incremental. So we know there's a guarantee program in effect, set that aside. This will not change any of those, at least it's not intended to, this isn't a layering on. So you're right, but don't worry about it. That piece shouldn't be affected.
Trust us.
Well, yeah, there you go. I can't wait to see the drafters trying to figure out, how do you
You got
actually.
two sets of revenue now. You got guaranteed and an incremental.
Yeah, well, we already have that in the basic levy. We have the equity people unit, we have the WPU value unit. I mean, we're getting very efficient at this, whether it's the best policy is a whole other discussion, but our drafters at the legislature are figuring these things out. This will be a complicated one.
So my voters have authorized 0.0016 and voted.
Correct.
Now.
Yep.
This index will go above what that voted authorization is,
Correct.
because that's different than how it is right now. If
Correct.
my tax valuation drops out, my board levy can exceed the max.
Yeah. Now this is a layering.
The voted can't, so you're saying,
It's layered on.
so that voted levy can be higher than what the actual authorization.
It's intended not to inhibit local governments from making independent decisions with their voted board and capital levies. This is on top, barring Richard's concern. This is designed to be additional revenues on top, independent of local decisions. It's also, this little piece will not be subject to truth and taxation. So you don't even have to address it with your public.
Will just be part of the certified tax rate
The
calculation.
assumption is that, however this thing gets drafted, so there's a lot of details that haven't been worked out. We know what the end goal is, which is not subject to truth and taxation. How you get it there, we got that all has to be figured out still. So good question. I would assume it ends up in that world, because boy, if you tried to do your truth and taxation notice and it didn't have this accounted in the certified rate, you're gonna do a math calculation that's your increase plus this indexing increase, and you don't want that in the papers because you don't have to explain, oh, this part's not us and this part is us. It's got to show up in that certified
Where's the
process.
charter school levy in this?
So in my estimation, and Rick can kick me under the table as soon as I say this, this is only a conversation with school districts because we're talking about bringing property tax into the discussion. You will see they don't have the ability to raise this property tax. And when we get into the equalization and its distribution, they are not in the base for distributions of WPU. So there's, in one sense, there is a whole part of our education system that is not accounted for in this exercise. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if there are other discussions happening out in the world with charter people to figure out how do they play in this tax restructuring world. The unintended consequence, however, will be that under the Senate Bill 38, these will be revenues recognized there. And so it will affect what your charter school local revenue rate is, which will then in turn provide funding to charter schools. We will have to make sure that, let's say this does advance, we're gonna figure out how that math works so that your local levies aren't being adversely impacted in a way that has you further behind than you were because of this local replacement calculation. So there's some really hard language challenges for drafters. We know the context, we know the intent. How do you get the real words on there to protect this? There is no intent to have districts go backward. This is all enhancement. And you guys are calling out all of the details we need to be aware of to make sure that the drafters don't just kind of skim right over and we have unintended consequences of lost revenue to districts when we said it was supposed to be an enhancement.
That charter school levy will still be part of our total board.
At this point, there is no conversation about charters, their funding and potential impacts. It's totally silent. I think the conversation will have to be, if we're going to accomplish this enhancement idea, there can't be a backward step because of Senate Bill 38, if that makes sense. We'll just, that's where you're really vigilant with drafters. That's a frowny face.
It's a neutral.
But it is, I mean, just out of the chute, it's a challenge. We have a whole part of our education system not even contemplated in this conversation. It's just not
Was that
there.
raised with the group that met?
I've brought it up in different ways. So I'm not in charge. I can only say something, but that wasn't even in their, that's not in their sights because they were totally focused on property tax, and that's a group that doesn't even rate property tax.
And not specific to this conversation, but you can imagine early on in conversations, we tried to make sure we were throwing things out like, hey, it would be really good to adjust the bond ballot language. You know, if you're gonna be at the table with us, that's a concern we have, we gotta fix it. And we got told pretty quick. As Todd just did, hey, listen, there's a lot of policy concerns education might have. There's a lot of funding concerns we're focused on this. I mean, we learned in a hurry to spend our energies on
What was in front of us.
on trying to keep this somewhat on the rails as we move forward. So we'll have to stay mindful of those things.
Thank you. So again, that was just, we're just on line one here.
Yeah.
Got a few more lines to go, which is fine. So the LFA's office ran the change CPI. So when they went and calculated what the change CPI would be for this scenario is 1.83%. So they used that number for all of the revenue projections. First year would generate about 18.6 million in property tax. By year 5, just shy of 98 million. So again, we're in the world of enhancement. This is more money. This is not impacting any other formulas or calculators. This is more dollars coming to public ed.
Can you get that split out? How much that was capital versus what?
No, it was just one happy number.
So Todd, I got
Yeah.
a question that
Yeah.
was sent to me. So
Oh, good.
why not create
So people can hear us talking.
Yes.
All right, good confirmation.
why not just create a new tax rate that's independent of all of our existing tax rate? That makes a lot of these calculations much simpler, does it not?
It does, and I would write that down as a recommendation. We did have a conversation that why don't we just manage this all through the basic levy? Don't even create another one, just manage it like we've already done with 2 other things that get siphoned off to restricted accounts and they get managed under some statutory provision. We had that conversation, and do I dare? So the idea on this one is that the basic levy does feel like a statewide levy, and there are legislators who do not want to be in the situation of raising property tax through a statewide levy. So they're willing to put in a provision that the locals will be the ones that actually have to impose this. Granted, we have all the nasties off, if you will. You don't have to go through truth and taxation. You don't have to do any of that, but it will happen at that local level. So that just know there's a mindset that there is a reason why this is being presented this way. Mathematically, I've had conversations with those who are probably gonna have to implement this. They would all say, why don't we just run this through like the basic levy and keep the math really simple. You can set your target dollars based on this concept. Oh, we need to raise 18.6, but don't touch those levies. Just that becomes the target number that you adjust the basic levy to generate. I mean, so there are easier methodologies.
You might know to that, Richard. You
My
wonder,
answer is question.
no, well, just because Todd keeps saying, yeah, these are good things we got to make note of. And I saw Richard write it down. So I'm just verifying that.
You're
capturing these
no.
things there.
And I'm hoping that all of you will independent, because there's a bunch of people not in the
Yeah.
room. Just write them down
Send them in.
and send them in to me. Just get it to me.
The
I'll
reason,
get it.
just procedurally, I'm asking that, I went to start taking some notes and I'm like, wait a minute. I don't think that given my background, I would catch the appropriate nuances on what the questions are. And we want to capture the nuances of the question or the key feedback or the comments. So yeah, it's helpful if individuals will send them in articulated in business administrator language. So that's all the reason I'm affirming.
Perfect.
So.
Thank you. Okay, ready for line 2? So line 2, these are, so it has the word state next to it because this is going to be income tax dollars. So this is not property tax. This is state revenue coming into the story. The idea of equalization in this proposal is that there would be an equal amount of money distributed on a WPU basis to all school districts. So that's the concept. It's going to be an equal amount, kind of like think of WPU. It's 3,500. This is going to be another piece. It's just everyone's going to get the same dollar for all of their WPUs. When you look at the tax generation, however, there are districts that will generate more revenue than this flat amount will be, or this equal amount will be. And there are districts that will generate less. So this particular piece is to help fund those districts that are below what that median calculation will be. I'll get into the details of that when I pull up the spreadsheet. But this is the concept part. This is, we know that there are a number of districts who will not be able to generate this equalized amount. So in the first year, to bring those districts up to just the median calculation would cost 5.5 million. If you run it out for the 5 years, it'll cost 31.8 million. Now this is enhanced money. This is new money coming in, something we've never had before. New dollars coming in, but it's also related to the property taxes being generated, because we're going to do some math here to show whether you're above or below median. So this is seen as a positive. This is new dollars coming in, and it's starting to touch upon the equalization aspect of the proposal. I know there's going to be a lot of questions on that. Let's just leave it at that for now, and then we can talk about the math. The next piece is a piece that we have never seen before in this context. Now, we've always talked about enrollment growth numbers, but we've had to defend it and ask for it and compel it to be appropriated every year. This will put it on auto appropriation. Whatever the growth number is, will be funded. So, we're growing, the money's there, we don't even have to say boo. This is seen as a positive for the legislators as they look at us. Well, if you had less growth, you wouldn't.
But if you have negative growth, be less.
For the system already goes negative if that happens. I mean, so it's not changing the fundamental principles. It's just saying we're going to fund whatever it is. You don't have to ask. We're going to fund it. So the estimates at the time we were talking was about 50 million. I think some numbers came out Tuesday that suggested it's 50.2 million. So we're pretty close. And that could grow to 58.5 million in the model that we have here. But just know that's a new feature. Budget on autopilot. This is a foreign concept. There has been resistance to ever have anything that's automatically appropriated. Keep that idea in mind as we talk about the last line. So the last line is that the state funding that goes into public education will be on the same index that the property tax is on. So the dollars that the state is putting into public education will grow also automatically at that change CPI rate. So in this model with 1.83%, it's going to happen every year also. Never happened before. We spend every year saying, how much money can we get on the WPU? This has now been put in autopilot.
So Todd, the 84 million, 1.83, an increase of 1.83 in the WP is not 84 million.
Correct, because this is all state funding going into education. So it's not just the minimum school program. It's not just the WPU portion of it. We're taking, if you added up that sheet that Ben puts together, if you go down to the bottom line.
Talking about above and below the line.
Yep.
As the basis.
The
on
base
which
for
we
this
multiply.
calculation, and it's the state dollars,
Zero sheet.
not the property. Because when you look at that sheet, there's some property tax pieces and strip all that out. Just look at the state support for public education. It's on an index now. That's what this is doing. Now, being on autopilot has the LFA a little concerned. What if there's a year where the growth says we should have 1.83% more, but there's only 1% actual revenue growth in the system? What do we
Welcome
do?
to our world.
Rainy day, rainy day.
You have a rainy day, but you have a static rainy day, but they want this to be stable, ongoing. Rainy day is only good for a few years. We want this to be on autopilot long-term. We don't want to have to revisit this in 20 years if we can help it. Let's make this work. So they're looking at the change CPI as that commitment. And if there are years of plenty, years when the actual revenues might grow at 8% and not 1.83%, that money is put into what would be considered an operational rainy day, not the static one that has one-time money in it, but it would actually earmark money aside and say, hey, this is ongoing dollar, but we're not going to put it into the system. We're going to park it in our rainy day fund so that the year or cycle that comes when we go at negative 2% growth, we can take on an ongoing dollar and cover that.
Sounds like Joseph.
It does.
Yeah.
So there's no statutory limit on that operation already.
Those are all details that will have to be figured out. The concept though is we're going to have a rate that makes sense and a rate that we can historically justify so that we know that the plus years will be able to support the minus years. And that there is no public ed just knows, hey, next year we're on the CPI, whatever that calculation is, we're good to go. We're not having to go before legislative bodies and asking for the CPI to be funded.
Is that change CPI a floor or is it the actual? So if there's additional available revenue, could they go above that if they chose to?
So I think that's open to discussion. I think they see it as a floor. I think it becomes our opportunity to say it's the floor and we should get other money for specific purposes. So we might get into more earmarking conversations, whereas the basic program is probably now on autopilot. If you read the language though, these dollars, so this $84 million isn't necessarily going into the value of the WPU. It's available for all of these public education discussions. So it could end up in a below the line program. We've just carved out the money, 84 million. Where does it go?
So I think what we're all saying is we can't let the floor become the ceiling.
Correct. Yeah, well said. And that's exactly the conversation we had with superintendents was, well, right now, we're already having to go up there every year and argue whatever's happened with new dollars, how much of that goes to certain line items. Well, first of all, how much of it do we actually get? And then how much of that goes to certain line items? And so in some regards, it doesn't change the necessity of still having those conversations, but it removes an element of the conversation that we've already had a starting point. And you're right, it's our obligation to make sure that it remains a floor and doesn't become the ceiling.
I know some of the concern, if you were to measure that 84 automatic with what we've actually received over the last several years, we've received a lot more than that. So,
So be careful in that thought.
so
I would say, I'm cutting you off, but
No,
before
that's
you
fine.
get too far down that thought, it's the 84 and the 18. It's the 84 and the 18 that you want to think about.
Okay,
But I
but
agree with the
even-
measure.
even if you add those two together,
Yep.
it's a lot less than what we've historically seen.
Well,
It's almost
his-
every year. And so we need to-
historically,
it just-
historically means in the last 6 years.
Well, I think over time,
For the last-
if you look over time, but
So-
the point being to reinforce what you
Yeah,
just said.
yeah.
Because I think there'll be a tendency on the part of some, based on
Sure.
what I've observed over time, to say, you're getting that, we're done. And there are people that would love to do that.
Absolutely.
We can't allow it to prevent you from going up there and going, this formula doesn't fund the emotional, emotional needs of our children and the security needs, and we need another $50 million to hire enough people that we don't have currently in our school.
So if there's a big lever for feedback, in my estimation, is what is this target?
And politically, I haven't had a report yet on how it went in the Republican caucus yesterday. The Democrats have been invited to meet with the speaker at 11 a.m. on Monday morning. He briefed me on an hour on Tuesday and asked me not to talk to anyone. I'm not. Although he gave me this document that you're looking at now. And we have to, the UEA told them, okay, but what's next? So, they're covering that angle. We have to be able to politically say, if we like this, and if we think this is adequate, then thank you for thinking of this, and thank you for trying to. One thing Wilson is he looks ahead. I mean, he's made a lot. He has helped direct the legislature make a lot of. Every 2 years we meet and we bring in people and we go, where are we 10, 20, 40, 50 years from now? He's been a big impetus behind that, without also saying, without groveling and going, oh, thank you so much for this. We'll never ask for anything again. I mean, there's a line we have to walk there.
I'm glad you've already been briefed on this. You can keep me on the straight and narrow, so I don't.
No, you have the detail that I don't have, which is why I'm here. So I want to hear the BA point of view.
Get the skinny on it. All right, so I'm going to take you to the next chart, just to reinforce a concept that was reinforced to us. This chart is simply to illustrate that this is a compounding calculation. So when we look at the CPI for year one, that then becomes the base as we look at the year two calculations. So that's all this is representing, is the dark and the light blue are combined together. They become the base for the subsequent year. So this isn't like 84 and it's just going to skim at 84 from here on out. This is intended to enhance funding for public ed over time on a compounding basis. So that's all that chart is there to help you see.
We need to keep referring back to that first figure that showed where
The trajectory.
this would have been in place, right?
Correct. And again, so here's my financial advisor hat, comes on really fast. Past performance is not indicative of future. It's like, just be careful. And so I'm a little, this is my skepticism, leery of chain CPI, because I'd rather have it actually be a target. To your point, hey, this thing, we've always had at least 180 to 250 million a year. It should be something that will generate that here on out, because that's at least what we have seen on a regular basis. If we're enhancing, don't get me to where we've been, get me to where we've not been.
Right.
And, and if chain CPI is cutting us at the knees and we're just going to get what we got, well, why would we even talk about a constitutional provision? We're just fine where we are, even though you make independent decisions, legislature that may use all the money.
Maybe that's okay.
Maybe that's not so bad.
So is it fair to say that, based on your previous chart, that with the state funding, they're subject to the chain CPI and then the property tax, is it fair to say that every year, assuming the chain CPI is at 1.83, we get 3.66% additional funding?
Well, they're two different bases. So you have the same rate, but two different bases. So it won't, when you look at the actual dollars, it won't feel like 3.6%. Because your education fund is a bigger base that you're applying it to than the property tax. I haven't done the math to figure out what the
But
true
you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So every year we have a guaranteed.
It's gonna move.
Point, it's gonna
Totally.
be,
Totally. And again, the caveat being that there will be years where more revenue will show up in the state coffers, but we shouldn't be motivated to ask for more dollars in those years, because those are the years that will cover when there's not enough revenue to keep that same commitment in place without changing it. So that's kind of it becomes a different dialogue when we come to the legislature. It's like, okay, now we got to get a little more sophisticated on our trajectories of revenues and expenses. And, we have to be a partner in trying to figure out what is the reasonable amount for that rainy day fund to have in it to cover downsides. Don't overfund it just because you don't want to appropriate it. Overfund it because we need to keep shortfalls covered. It's a way more sophisticated conversation than I have a need, you have a dollar. Now we're saying, I have a need, you have a dollar, how do we make this work in the long term?
Have there been any discussions about what is our goal? And when I'm speaking of that, I'm thinking about where we stand as compared to the rest of the world around us. So do we have a goal? Do we have a goal to get out from under the basement? Or do we have a goal to just kind of sit where we are? Because I would like to know what the goal is of all of this, other than ultimately, to guarantee a minimum level of funding to education every year and give me a good excuse to drop tax rates for income
Well,
tax.
I can tell you, Todd can affirm this, but in the very first meeting, right out of the gate, I said, hey, let's put something out there that we're trying to accomplish. I mean, let's get us to like 40th. Let's run stuff to at least get us to 40th instead of 50th. And some really early projections before anybody had really looked at it. They ran a calculation that put us at 41st. And I was like, hallelujah, we're there. And they're like, yeah, that trajectory line was like this, and we were savvy enough to know that that wasn't going to get any traction. But we've been saying that since day one. Like, listen, we've got to move off of being 50th or 51st. You can debate which one that even is. So they've never settled in on a target like that, if you will, but they've been hearing it since day one. I think this 20-year look back, if you will, if that were to have been applied, would be something like 46th or 47th instead of 50th on that historical look back chart. But yeah, we've been pretty overt on saying it's got to move the dial. And again, they haven't.
But there's not a flag in the ground.
Exactly. But there is a flag in the ground to say it has to be an upward trajectory. It can't be a goal to just do all the things you did and then we're where we were 10, 5, 10, 30 years ago.
So Tom, has there been any conversation? So let's say this all goes through and we're all good and we make it work. If this is all statutory language.
Right.
We move forward, the constitutional language goes away. 10 years from now, our good representatives have all moved on to other things and we have a whole new group there. Is there any, I know guarantee is a tough word, but is there any going forward that some of this couldn't change?
The discussion I have been given is that there will be new constitutional language and new statutory language. So when I talked to Ben Leishman 2 weeks ago, when I got an early version of this, and I just walked in his office and said, explain this to me. I asked him if the lawyers on the second floor had started working yet on new constitutional language. And I was told we're not there yet. But my understanding is that they understand. I was told, and I'm not telling you who told me because I've had multiple discussions with multiple people. The constitutional language hasn't guaranteed you funding. I said, well, there's purposes for, I asked him this question. I talked to my government students when I was teaching, and I say, we have a law in the books that says it's against the law to commit adultery, but we never prosecute it. So why do we have a law in the books that we don't prosecute? Because we state our values. We have there's symbolic reasons for putting that there. And I was told, we understand the symbolism and we understand why it's important to have there. And we need some constitutional language. We won't take out constitutional language and not propose other constitutional language. But that constitutional language will not have the nuance or the ability to do this.
Well,
That's the big.
and here's
concept.
to use Todd's phrase that he just used, if we've had a flag in the ground, it's been on that topic. We have absolutely, on the 50-yard line, stuck it in and we said, listen, you're gonna get no support out of school boards, superintendents, business administrators,
Teachers.
to remove teachers, to remove if you're gonna remove constitutional language and you're not going to replace constitutional language. So I'd say where we were maybe a couple of weeks ago in the last meeting I was in with the speaker was, Mr. Speaker, and well, the president was there too. We would like to believe that we have been good enough collaborators on this conversation that we've earned the right and the respect, having been involved in the tables and the spreadsheets and the charts and the graphs, to now be at the table on the language writing. And the speaker looked at me and said, Rick, the answer to you is yes. And that's a meeting where we just reaffirmed to them, we have got to have constitutional language. And what I think I can safely report to you is USBA is working hard to move forward on some concepts with constitutional language, independent of the writers on the second floor. Because what we want to do when it comes the time to sit down and have the conversation, we want to bring something that we've already conceptualized, that we've already written, that we've already drafted. So then we're not coming to that conversation simply as invitees providing wordsmithing to something they've already looked at. That we're coming to that table saying, we've drafted something, and I won't announce their names yet, but we've got heavy hitters, like as heavy hitters as you can find. We've got heavy hitters working with us on our constitutional language concept plan. It won't end up being that. You have to go through processes, as you all know. But anyway, because, and I made a note to not forget that, just so now that we're having that conversation, we tried to say to them, well, why do you have to remove the constitutional language? You could do all of this without changing the constitutional language. And we were told, and we get it, you guys, this is a package deal. The reason we're having this conversation with you is because we feel we've got to change the constitutional language regarding income tax. And that's when our response back was, well, okay, if we believe that this is a good package on the finance part of it, and you're telling us you have to change what is it Article 13? I know what section, article something.
10 or 13.
Well, 10 is education funding, 13 is, I know that it's in 13.
13 is the
Right.
income tax can go to higher ed.
Correct. So they said, no, if we're going to buy off on this, then we're telling you that the constitutional earmark in 13 is changing. And our retort back is, well, okay, if that's the case, then we're telling you it can't be removed without a replacement. And so we're actually suggesting that some things be added into 10, section 10, because 10 is focused on education. 13 is focused on the broader.
I'm really happy to hear that you're
Correct.
working on an independent side track.
So anyway, to restate and come back around, we've got an absolute stake in the ground on that one.
That's a good question because that's going to come up.
Correct.
And I think that because the education committee has been united, they heard that.
Right.
I was told, and in my discussions, they got it.
Yeah.
They got that they're not going to take it out, just leave it out and say, oh, well, it's all this.
It actually took a few meetings, actually. We've had that flag in the ground since minute one. But in their minds, there's some things in here that stabilize education funding. Like they'll say things like, well, we've never ever messed with property tax. So we're not gonna, and we're like, okay, fine,
Yes, we have.
we're glad you feel that way, yeah. We're glad you feel that way, but we're still not gonna ever buy off on language coming out, another language not going in. So after a few times that we've restated that, you're right, it's sunk in that we have to have it, so. Okay,
All right.
So outside question. So
Outside.
the ongoing rainy day fund, again, another question.
Yeah.
What it happens in the case that it does go negative, then what?
So that's a problem for the legislature. There's not a safeguard built in for the outside.
There, I did hear that someone raised the specter of the early 1980s. And some legislators have pushed back and said, well, okay, we get the idea that you want to stabilize. And we get the idea that we don't want to have every year. We understand the concept that it's a good thing to have some stability and there's some certainty and some growth. But what if you have, 1981 or 1982, we can't support it. You're gonna have to have some outs because no one's gonna go in there and raise people's property taxes like X in order to fund this thing. So, it's great, as you pointed out, we've had 5 years of great funding. I mean, we've seen some real growth, but what happens when we don't have the stability? What happens when we don't have 1.5 to 2% inflation and low federal interest rates, Fed rates? And what happens if we have another crisis? What are our outs? I mean, we have to talk very carefully about what those safety valves are, if any.
So inflation hits 14%.
What do we do?
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Keep derailing you.
No, you're good. We're feeling okay. Not about the context, but just.
I have one,
we're in
can I
the
ask
room,
one
we're
question
okay.
about the chart?
Yeah.
Your year prior to the first year of judgment, you've taken prior year, you've taken enrollment growth and made that the base for year one. And on top of that, we had enrollment growth and then the new formula change CPI. But for year two adjustment, you've taken all three of those figures to make it the new base, not the bottom two. So that's their concept, is that the change CPI, that additional change CPI addition becomes part of the base for the next year?
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, because that's an important,
Yeah.
It is. It's a big
Yeah.
distinction. And it's not in the year one because.
because it didn't exist,
Yeah,
because
correct.
it's a new
Yeah,
concept.
that's what
It just wasn't online yet.
Just,
Yeah.
I've been thinking about Ronald Reagan.
They can fund new growth without any policy adjustments. They can't really do the
It's a
change.
victory for us. It's a victory for us if they even say that comes off the top and we don't even talk about it.
Correct.
I've been thinking about Ronald Reagan. I'm thinking the new version is verifying that trust.
There you go. I thought it was trusting. You got it the other way around.
Yeah, well, I want to verify.
All right, so we're gonna go to box C. And I know this is where more attention is coming is in the next two sections. So just as the legislature is asking for flexibility and being able to use the various sources of revenue to fund government, they also recognize that we have the need for flexibility within our funding as well. And they know that capital can only be used for capital purposes and the other levies for M&O. I mean, that's understood. And so what they were proposing here is that the board and capital levies would have a shared cap so that you can manage your needs between those two levies. If you need more dollars for your operational side, you can lean into your capital cap and pull those dollars onto your M&O side. It would have an M&O purpose. It wouldn't have a capital purpose as you do that. So that's the idea there. We've seen different variations of this in the past. When we went through the last recession, there was statutory language that allowed districts of a certain size to be able to move dollars. Just you could transfer it out of capital into M&O. There's introduction that you could have some M&O elements built in your capital side. So whether you have staff that are assigned for physical facilities and capital construction, you don't have to run them on the M&O side. You can run them on the capital side. I mean, there's been different forays into this flexibility. This one is taking the cap and using this as an opportunity to just balance between the two for your local needs.
And isn't it fair to say a local district, Zane alluded to this earlier, but a local district will have to decide whether this is a sound policy decision to get into this arena, to start pulling the capital cap over into no functions or not. But you'd have to just make that determination at the local level.
Yeah,
Well, yeah. So this is where I think there could be a perception of this not really being a fairly equalized thing, because if I'm getting equalization money in capital already, and now I got flexibility to do this with this and move that into M&O, it seems to me that is gonna throw more imbalance into that equalization thing. I mean, I really have a problem with taking the guardrails off of how you can use capital money.
great input.
Good feedback.
Because it's gonna, it will have that potential, and in my mind, probably is already existing within current guidelines. Yeah. Last year, when they took the rails off, they took the guideline, they basically took the rails off the debt service levy, right? That when that happened, created an unfair advantage for some people.
Good insight. Thank you.
Okay.
I wouldn't say this is one we were pushing. I think this is one they were kind of
I think,
offering up to say, does this help local LEAs feel better about the entire plan? I wouldn't say that this is one that we,
Key.
yeah, this isn't a key element to it, but so that's why that really is important. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, that's okay. So school boards have the ability to increase tax rates right now.
Up to your cap. So this is messing with caps.
So if we wanted to take the board local above 25, we
You
could.
can, you can lean into your capital levy to do that. Yes.
Correct.
So this is for those who are at the top.
Could I just say I'm gonna have a 0055 voted leeway and not have a capital or board? Because that's
So
what we
voted-
equalized.
So this doesn't contemplate voted. This is between
Oh.
your board and capital.
Just board and capital.
Board and capital. Because they are very conscious that they didn't want the flexibility to flow into a conversation that you would have with your public. And they feel that the voted leeway has a check and balance on it, which is you have to take the proposition to the people. They didn't want that one moving just because you wanted flexibility. You have to have that conversation.
So then why does it say voted board and capital?
That's, okay, now you're into equalization.
On that sheet?
Yeah.
Okay,
This
so
is
stay on it.
flexibility.
Correct.
This is box C,
Okay.
flexibility.
The spreadsheet
Okay.
only applies to box B.
Okay.
Wait, we just want to get to the spreadsheet. I'm wasting an hour and a half
That's
on the
fine.
fluff. We just want to talk spreadsheets here. I should have known BAs. But before we get to the spreadsheet, I got to talk about the concepts. So I'm going to take you to the next page. This is box D now. I'm not going to go through the language. I'm just going to take you to the chart. So the idea here is that there is an equalization based on median revenue generation per WQ of these new revenues. So just keep in mind, we're going to increase property taxes by the 1.83% in this model. That's going to generate some money in every district, and every district has a different valuation within their geographical areas that will create disparity in how much money is available to each of those districts on this one set rate. And so there's a need in some of our legislators' minds that shouldn't happen, that disparity is a problem in our system, so it needs to be equalized. And so in this model, the decision was to use median revenue generated on a WQ basis of those new dollars. Okay, so when you look at this chart up here, you'll see a line called median. There's a mathematical calculation we'll get to on the spreadsheet, but just know there's a median calculation out there. The blue bars are how much revenue a given district will generate by imposing that indexed rate. Okay, so there's some new money coming in. A district A, call it a Park City School District. If I impose the same rate as everybody else, I generate more revenue. Even though it's the same rate, I just have a bigger base. Talking base.
That was the revelatory statement we were all waiting for.
I'll use a different, I'll use Ogden. Oddly enough, Ogden is a District A case scenario, but we won't get there yet. So we'll stick with Park City because that's, I own it. So the revenue above the median will be pooled. So it'll be
So
taken,
that
that pink.
above color is
Yeah.
really blue revenue,
It is
but
blue.
it exceeds the median.
Exactly.
Correct.
So that money will be swept away from the districts that are above the median. And then
It'll be pooled.
it'll be pooled, it's pooled, and then that pool will be redistributed on a WQ basis across the whole
Goes to that
system.
light green area on the.
Oh, no, that's not the green, so I'm in District A right now. So that redistribution of the above median dollars is that little blue box at the top of the buff, if we're gonna call it that color.
Because District C won't be able to generate any revenue to get that small.
Correct, yeah.
Correct.
So, but this is just the District A story. So equalization will be for everybody in the system because we are enhancing revenue for public education for the whole district system. Okay, so everybody's going to participate. Everybody's ahead. The District A is ahead of last year by the blue, dark blue, plus the light blue. It's money it didn't have before, all new money. Now you could be a District B. A District B, in this chart, yep, District B, you're at median. There's actually one district that is, well, you have to have someone be the median. So there is one district that is median. The math works. They don't make any contribution, so they have no above median dollar, but because of that redistribution of the pool, they will get their WPU portion of that money out of the pool.
That $18 million.
The $18 million in the fifth year.
Yeah.
Yep. So that's that little blue bar. Now we have District C. These are districts that you impose that same index as everybody else, but your tax base is just not big enough to hit the median. The state will use income tax dollars to the tune of the green box. So you will get to median, even though your locale couldn't generate the money to get there, you will get enough money to get to the median. And then you also will receive out of the pool, just like everybody else on the WQ basis, the blue bar. So that's the concept, is it's equalized at median. Revenues above median will be shared, pooled, and then redistributed to everybody. So it's not going to go to those who weren't above median only. It's going to go to the whole system.
So the pool doesn't create the equalized, the green is state dollars. Is
And
income
green is
tax
state dollars. That creates equalization.
to the median,
Correct.
Not necessarily income tax money.
It is.
They do their thing.
state.
So yeah, we can have fun, but by
State
intent,
money.
by
State
intent,
money.
it's state money.
So this equalized state money is not part of the chain CPI piece.
No,
that
so
we're
if you go back,
That's totally outside of that.
yep, so if you go back to this
So it
bar,
goes back to that right there.
yeah, so this line here, this is money that's not part of the
Line 2.
line 2 yet.
Okay,
I got my
all
right
right,
hand
All
on
right.
it.
Can you show me that line on this spreadsheet?
I will in just a minute.
Do you remember to do that?
I will try to remember. But I'll use a chart to get to the same place,
Okay,
but I will walk you through.
I just want to
We're
know
we're
where
gonna get
that,
there. I promise, Janet. We
I
will not
just
end
want to
with the
know,
help.
I just want to know where that is. That's all.
Sure. There's actually a column on the spreadsheet that is the green.
Okay.
All right, so great concept. We understand how the theory works. This chart, the last chart on the page is now taking the theory and applying it to the school districts under this model. Where are you in this funding proposal with regards to equalization? So you see, it's not really a line, but you see a break between the light blue and the green and the dark blue. So there's kind of like a white line there. So that's your median number. Off of the spreadsheet, the median number is $142 per WPU. Okay. So that's if we take the revenues generated by that index and we look to see how does that revenue spread out through the system, everybody's going to get $142. And those with green boxes are the ones that will be getting some portion of state money to get you to the 142 mark. Okay.
This is above the current weighted PPU.
Totally above. This is independent, if you will. It's even independent. This is like its own bucket. Thank you. It's an add-on. So you can see the magnitude of the green is how far away are you from that median? That's how much state money has to be generated to get you to median. Okay,
Which is again 142, right?
142.
Great.
The blue boxes, the light blue boxes that get up to the brown bar, that's the redistribution of all revenues collected above median by those districts who are generating above median, which is the orange. So if you go to the orange, it's all of the orange dollars pooled together and then spread back out on a WQ basis. It represents in this model another $20 on top of the 142.
Which is
That's what's
light
funding
blue
the
at the
light
top.
The light blue, yeah. So the orange is funding the light blue.
All of this added together, all of that added together funds all of that all along there. And that little light blue box is equal to $20.
So it's 160.
So it makes it 162.
162, yeah.
Correct.
All right. So if you wanted to know where the
So this would just be year one.
this is year 5.
Year five.
This is taking the year 5 scenario. So if you wanted to know who's our median school district, Garfield. They have all blue and then light blue. No orange below, no green above. I mean, is that
Box elders.
Box Elder might be close, but we'll see in the tables that they're actually contributing about $9,000 into the deal. Too small to see on this chart.
Yeah.
So that's your median calculation.
Janet, we're gonna have to send you a nice Christmas card every year. Say thank you. And Todd, you too.
Well, you should have been doing that for years. If you're gonna do it,
Like what's new?
you're a little late.
I've been doing it already.
All right, so
Now I see that.
are we ready for spreadsheets?
Janet, are you ready?
Yeah,
Is
no.
anyone texting questions? Are there questions coming in from our listening audience? All right, so page 1 of the spreadsheets is one that no one really cares about, but we just want to show that we actually did the math. So this is just taking you based on your assessed valuations, what does 1.83% generate on the chain CPI in year 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5? Left side is what's coming out of your property taxes. And the right side is what has to come from state revenue to get you to median. So that's,
That's not the redistribution, that's just to the 142.
this is just, where are the dollars coming from? When
Those
do
are
they
all
have
the
to
districts
show
on the
up?
right that need.
This is the revenue spreadsheet, right? Like,
This is just the revenue side. This is not equalization. This is just, well, I mean, it has a
Now I
piece of
see.
equalization into it, but
Yeah.
it's not the bigger property tax piece that's gonna get
and
equalized.
you're all quicker learners than me. When I listened to Todd a week ago, I did things like I wrote in new revenue at the top of this. I wrote in statewide because it's statewide revenue. He already said it, but I highlighted that this is year 5. When we're over in the far right-hand column, it's year 5. Because like he just stated a minute ago, the charts are all based on year 5. So just a guy like me had to make some of those notes to remind myself how to share it with my board.
So
This is that green on your bar chart, this is the green section.
Yeah, green is on the right.
So if you look at the estimated state funding to equalize to median, so these 5 years, those are the green bars.
Yep.
Now the chart was year 5. So you're really running.
So
with
year
your last-
5 is the chart.
That's conceptual. So that's not tied to anything. That's just the concept of how the equalization will work. If you go to the bar charts on the bottom of the page, we're taking the 5th year column of data. We're now going to map that out to say, okay, how does this thing really work district by district? Okay. So page 1 is revenues. Am I moving off to your?
If I look at just year 1, for example, for Davis, 1.4 million, that's board voted and capital increased revenues above what we're currently generating. For the voted, for example, that would not be counted as collections in my current guarantee.
Correct.
Okay.
This is above and beyond. By design, if we ever get something written that does something different, then we just vote.
This based on fiscal 19.
Say,
fiscal 20 tax rates.
Well, we don't have 20 tax rates. I think they took it
We're in
off.
fiscal 20. So
Yeah, so I think they're using,
current year tax rates are like.
I want to say it was 18 is the rates that they have, because 19 isn't available. It's the last tax year that's available, is what Thomas used. So go tax commission, say what's available, not the current tax, correct. And again, this isn't rate driven, this is assessed valuations with a 1.83% calculation. Yeah, so there's some tricks, there's some drafting language that we have to be careful with, whether it's based off of revenue or is it your prior year levy? Because like was asked earlier, if you start moving your levy around, does that change this calculation?
So clarify for me, if I have a $5 billion assessed value, you came up with that $438 how?
As I understand it,
$438,000 now? That 1.83% of my assessed value.
go ahead.
You go ahead.
Yeah,
I know where. it came.
okay, well then explain it.
No, you tell.
No, you
Because
did.
you talked with Ben.
I did. But what do you understand? I want to make sure we got the same understanding, maybe
Times 1.8.
I backed into it and it's based on
your
my
levy.
voted board and capital levy.
Okay.
So whatever your levy is, based on that 1.83% increase in your assessed value, that's where that comes from.
But it's,
So it is based on.
Yeah.
It
current
is.
levies.
but
It
the,
is.
the trick is in moving forward, the local levy decision-making will not impact this. That's why I keep saying it's gonna be really hard for the drafters.
Yeah,
To,
okay.
to get to that concept. I can't even imagine what the sentence looks like.
Yeah.
We know the concept. I don't know the sentence.
So if I
We do the
take
numbers, we leave the words to the superintendent.
And you
Oh, no.
multiply it by the difference between the rate that they used and 1.83, that's how you get that.
Okay, this is distribution.
Now we're to page 2. This is now the equalization.
We've been talking
distribution.
revenue.
Excellent. So the question is, I think going back to the previous slide, the other, so the columns on the left would be required additional revenue that would need to be raised locally.
Not all of that goes into the pool. So this is the gross revenue generation from the indexing. If you're above median, that will
If
go.
you're above median, it goes into the.
So the next spreadsheet will get into
All
what
what we generated as part of this rolling process.
Correct.
Those 5 columns on the left, all from individual locals, and the columns on the right are all from the state.
Correct.
So there's a line there, state, local.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
This makes sense.
Yeah. You're number 2.
This actually explains it.
All right.
The state's the addition necessary to get everyone up.
To the median. Yep.
Correct.
All right, so I see conversation going. Are we ready to move, or do we have some other questions? We're good? Okay. All right, so I'm gonna walk through columns now, because without walking through columns, I lost superintendents really fast.
Makes sense. Now that I understand this.
I've learned a few lessons. So column 1, straightforward, that's your district. Column 5 the next column is year 5. So we are modeling the 5th year of this, not year 1. We're pushing out, what does this look like in year 5? And so there was an effort to just do a really rough estimate of what WPUs might look like in 5 years from now. We have a hard enough time figuring out next year. So take all of this with a grain of salt. These charts, or this table, should show you direction and magnitude, but don't walk away saying that's how much money I'm gonna get. This is not the number, it's a swag. It's a total swag. So when I presented this to my school board and they said, we're gonna have 6,100 kids in 5 years, not a chance. We're not growing like that. We'll be lucky to get 5,200 or something, so just take it for a modeling. Again, magnitude, direction,
It's
not the
WPUs,
dollar.
That's WPUs, yeah.
Correct.
But even the
Even
revenues we're talking
even that.
about is assuming a whole
Yeah.
bunch of stuff. So
Right.
just be careful. Don't walk away and say, I'm gonna be shorted $10 million on this. It's like, well, who knows? But you're gonna probably be shorted. We just don't know. The next column is under the VBC index. So this is voted board and capital levies are being indexed. And this is how much revenue, so if you went to that other page and looked at year 5, this is how much revenue that indexing generates in each of the school districts. So this is
Without any additional state dollars.
without any, this is just the levy, just that levy index, all by itself. Gross revenue. Don't think about median or anything like that. This is all the money generated by that index. Then the next column is revenue divided by your 5th year WPU
I
projection.
sent that, so those 5, the previous chart, those 5 right columns, the state money coming in.
Not state money. This is still just the left.
Local. Okay.
This is the left side, 5th year column, left side, 5th year column.
And that's where the 142 is generated.
So if you go down, so this is your revenue per WPU from the indexed money. And then if you go down to the bottom, you'll see that the median, and you can run a median calculation, the median is $142. So that's a magic number right now, because this whole equalization is based on the idea that we are going to equalize to median.
So the 31 million next to the one, just to the right of the 142 is what their growth chart showed. They thought the indexing would bring the 1.8, the change CPI added to the, against the BBC.
So that is a different, let me explain that one then. So to this point, this is just property tax dollars in year 5. And then we take the year 5 equalization of income tax dollars, so state money, to bring those districts below median to the median.
That's what gets them to the 142.
Correct.
And that gets the districts that have a revenue number in this column are the ones that are below median that need money to get to median.
So can I just test it?
You can use Nebo if you want. I mean, I'm sitting here. So Nebo generates that, right? In year
3.6.
5.
Yep.
That divided by that puts Nebo at 75, right? Because 75 is less than 142, Nebo requires 66. Because that plus that equals 142, which means Nebo needed to get that dollar amount out of the state equalization pot to get to the 142. Is that right?
That's clarified out because that's actually 141.
Rounding.
So
You're right.
This is.
Now you know why he had the superintendent.
I had 3 superintendents come up and say,
That's not adding up right.
yeah, I know, rounding.
So
This is local.
this is state.
Correct.
Correct.
Yeah, there should be a header there that says.
Okay.
That does say state equal. Yeah, so BBC is local. I mean, that's just shorthand for voting board.
And that money's coming from wherever.
From state sources.
So in recessionary periods, is that state equalization portion possibly coming out of that ongoing rainy day fund?
That's the green bar, right, Todd?
That's, yeah, so this
This is
column
the-
represents the green
This is
bar.
the green bar on the bar chart. Right? And this is, was it a dark blue bar on the bar chart?
Yeah, dark blue.
So yeah, this is your dark blue bar on the bar chart. This is the green bar on the bar chart. In a minute, we'll get to the light
Light
blue.
blue. Okay, so the next column under the header total, this is just taking your voted board capital revenue column and adding it to the state revenue column. You're just adding the two together and dividing that number through by the year 5 WPUs. And then this tells you what you're generating on a WPU basis. This then becomes the measuring rod to say who is generating above median, because we have a pool exercise to do now. So you can see you've got like Alpine's at 142, Beaver's at 165. Oh, that's above the 142, so we're gonna have to do something about that. So the next column represents how much above the median you are. So that first column is the dollar amount. So for Alpine, they're not above, so it's a 0. or a Beaver, they're $24 above the median. Does that make sense? So as you go down, how many dollars are you above median on a WPU basis? The revenue column, so then the one that says total, this is just taking your WPUs times how much are you above WPU to identify what will be contributed to the pool. So this is your contribution. You're not adding at this point. You're just finding out how much money is going to be redistributed. If you go to the bottom of that column,
And Todd, is it fair to say that this column right here is the orange?
yes,
The below the line bars that are orange on the bar chart?
Yep.
So that's the numeric representation of those orange bars,
Is it the orange or
the yellow or whatever.
well, that's where they're coming from, right? But it's actually feeding the light blues line.
It's gonna feed
it will in a minute.
It will in a minute. Yeah,
Okay,
so
but these numbers can be found on that chart.
correct. So this is the orange column right here.
Right.
Okay. So if you know, those revenues above median on a WP basis add up to about $15.9 million. That will now be redistributed across all of the districts, not just those who are above median or below. I mean, it's going to go to everybody. So if you take that same 15.9 million and you divide it through by the total number of WPUs in this year 5 model, it equates to $20 per WPU. So that's how much money you will receive through that property tax equalization portion. So at the end of the day, you would add your, this is where I always get messed up with everybody.
So let me state it. So you would take the total. So you generate what's in column, the revenue column there, BBC. Everybody generates that.
Correct.
Plus you would add what you get for equalization
In the
because you're
second
under
to last
the,
column.
you're under the 142. Okay. So you end up totally with what's in the revenue column, but if you're over that median, then you gotta write a check for what's in the above median amount. At the end of the day, you're gonna get back
This
what's
other
in
number.
the right-hand column. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yes,
The
that's,
cost of those difference is the difference between above median.
So if you look at
So-
that one
so-
column,
so it's
anything over
essentially-
20 is what you contribute.
it
Right.
is, you will receive this amount through your collections and state support. You'll receive this amount and you will return this amount. So this is where we lost some of our superintendents. It's not additive across the columns. It's, you have an addition here, additional, and if you are in a scenario above median, you have to subtract that out to know what your net revenue position would be. And it's all positive. There is no one who goes negative in this scenario.
One more column with that net change
Would be helpful. Yep. So I actually have one.
The other quick math I shared with superintendents is just your WPU multiplied by 162.
Yeah, that's your shortcut.
Right, that's your shortcut around it for the guys that the spreadsheet was confusing all of us. We in a hurry went, well, wait a minute, just do your WPU times $162 and that's the net gain to your district. But it's for a district like mine that's not returning money. That is generating more, and then I'm sitting there with that orange bar and I'm having to kick it back. I want to understand the entire mechanics of the spreadsheet, not just multiply by.
So just one word of warning, when you do the shortcut math, there's a lot of rounding in this spreadsheet.
Right.
So I had a number of superintendents come to me and say, hey, you're off by $20,000. Yep, you're probably right. Because on the whole, it's off about $280,000 if you just do the 162 by the W. It's, you
So
know,
Todd, I'm curious, in your world and in Janet's world, how do you tell your constituents, we're raising taxes $643 per WPU to get 162 back?
And before you answer that, I want to say
I'll tell you, because I
something.
answered it
Okay.
Tuesday night.
Yeah.
Because when Phil Dean came to the business administrator meeting, and these are Zane's notes, not really new money, different money, shifting burden to property tax. So you haven't gotten into any of the tax reform conversations.
No, this
This
is
is-
very narrow.
This is very narrow. This is
Absolutely.
assuming that this would be additional revenue. But if this
No,
is
it's not
true,
assuming, its intent
it
is to generate additional revenue.
not really new money, different money, shifting burden to property tax. That's what Bill Dean said. So if that's the
nice. I mean,
case,
that's the governor's person looking at it. I have
Yeah.
no idea.
Okay.
how
Well,
they
I'm just
read
looking,
it.
the only way this is enhancement is if the status remains quo going forward.
Absolutely.
Sure.
And,
Right.
and that was the understanding at the start of the conversation. is-
Otherwise,
is
it
that we
is
have a
exactly what I
baseline.
said. It's not new, it's different.
And there is,
With some different guarantees. And I
Sure.
guess the only thing I would add
Yeah.
to that is we already have an equalization formula in place intended to bring people up to current
Yeah.
with what they're doing with the, freezing the basic rate for the next 5 years, the value WPU. This is a creation to kind of shift the burden and give the legislature an excuse to say, we're not raising taxes. Look at your local guys.
you can come to that conclusion.
And it's
Other-
a complicated
But
way to
but
do
in
it.
fairness to it, it's also look that they have the understanding and belief that property tax is the most stable tax source. So we may say we're shifting.
I don't argue with that, but
They are in trying to be stable, they're going to the source that is stable, or relatively speaking stable.
they're going to our piece of that source.
Correct. They could just as well have gone to the basic levy and accomplished the same task,
And
but
it would
we
have
already
been a
answered
lot
that question
simpler.
earlier.
A whole lot simpler in my mind.
Yeah, so my conversation to get to the, how did my board react? They just looked at these two columns here. I gotta find out where I am on here.
Look at the big number.
Oh, this one?
Yes.
Well, that's because salt is too low. You can't see it. So they said, our community is gonna pay $3 million and only get 122 back. They ignored the fact that we're gonna get some 900,000 just anyway, but this is the conversation that they're having to brace themselves for. I'm on the radio Monday if you want to listen to KPCW. I gotta explain this to the community in that setting.
Well,
So-
it's a heck of a position to
so
have
that's-
to be in.
So after I explained it to my board, and you can go, and if you want to go look to see how I explained it to my board, you can go, it's streamed, you can go pull it up. My board was dumbfounded. They just looked at me after I was done explaining all of this. And then the first comment from my board president was, Todd, better go hire an attorney and figure out how to get us out of the minimum school program. There is a problem with the equalization from my board's perspective. I don't think they had a problem with the other parts. Not terribly. I mean, they still think that property tax is not the most stable. It has its ups and downs as well. So there's some philosophical differences there without any math to prove one way or the other. But this equalization is a challenge.
How did the superintendents view
I think, I think the ones that are from Salt Lake and Park City and from Canyons, I think that that's a pretty good representation of that. The one thing that I've tried to be mindful of, I mean, clearly Nebo District, whenever you're talking equalization, and so I've tried to make sure, in fact, Jerry Holmes was apologetic to me afterwards because he spoke up strongly out of North Summit about concerns on the equalization. Then afterwards, he's like, Rick, I don't know that I should have said that. I'm sitting up there next to you and I'm like, Jerry, you don't have to apologize for speaking up on behalf of your district and your board. I said that you don't have to do that. And so here's the couple of things that I continue to have in the back of my mind. Anytime equalization has had any traction at all, it's been a new money conversation. So I do acknowledge that they recognize that right out of the gate, that if the Senate's going to require equalization to be part of it, in fact, not only did they recognize it, we restated it. Don't even talk to us about equalization if it's just redistribution. So they've heard that and they've tried to address this new money issue. The other thing that I believe is happening is we told them how unpalatable it would be for a district to gather the money in property tax and cut a check back to the state and say, yeah, we gathered the property tax money and we sent it back. In hearing our comments on how unpalatable that was, I think what they're actually looking to do is say, well, we would actually do a state WPU distribution offset. So you would still retain your property tax, if you will, in these districts that send money back in. You'd retain the property tax. You'd just get less state money coming to you on equalization. Did I hear that right, Todd?
Yeah,
Give the more intelligent.
Yeah, now we're getting into the details.
Correct, yeah.
So these would be targets.
Right.
You know, so that 15.9 would be a target, and then it would walk back over to your mix on the WPU calculation on how much state money you get, how much local money you contribute to the basic levy.
Right.
It would just get added on to that. So you would see less state money come through under that distribution formula, and the money that gets pushed out over the top of the 3,500 would be the money that gets equalized. So it looked like state money in the full equalization concept because it's going to be run through the basic levy.
Correct.
Would it also be true generally that if I'm in a district whose enrollment is stagnant or declining, the odds are I'm going to be moved more and more. I'll become a contributor eventually.
Yes,
Yes.
there's that. You also have, if you're a district whose property assessed valuations seem to be on a steady decline, you'll find yourself deeper into the equalization portion as
Yeah.
well. So, you know, so there's multiple dynamics, which we experience right now anyway in the basic levy, but we're so many of us are so far away from the tip of it that you don't really see the fluctuations. If you're Park City, we watch it really closely because I'm sitting,
Big deal.
it just means every new dollar that came in is going to go back to the state because I'm already, you know, so I know it acutely because I actually do have to cut a check. So I know what it is.
So Todd, so this would go on top of, if I'm understanding correctly, any equalization that is currently in place.
Yes, ma'am.
So this would go on top of the basic rate equalization, the capital equalization that we have, and then this voted aboard leeway guarantee, and also this new freezing up the basic rate. So this is on top of
Yeah.
that.
Think like the TSSA. So if you understand how the TSSA works, there's a legislative appropriation,
Yeah.
and then there's a property tax portion which is tied to the increase in the value of the WPU. Those $2 come together into the restricted account that then becomes the WPU-based distribution of TSSA.
Yeah.
It's kind of think in those terms. It's new dollars. You weren't already assessing the levy. It grew because something else moved. And so think in those terms.
And Todd, that's the other thing that I wanted to comment in relation to superintendent response. So the new dollars then, the new revenue is
Yeah,
$129 million of new revenue
This is 31.
in year 5.
32 million.
in year 5. Well, 129 million of new revenue in year 5. And the redistribution through equalization is $16 million in year
So
5.
of the 139, 16 gets reached.
So that's a thing to keep in mind, which is something that, and I'm saying that again, in response to what superintendents were grappling with. It's like, wow, okay, that's an interesting spot to be in, right? That we're generating 129 million of new revenue, and there's a demand that some of that has to be equalized, and it's 16 million of the 129 that's equalized. And clearly there's,
No, there would also be the 31.8 million of state revenue that is equalized.
That's in the 129.
That's in the
That is
It's
in
in
part of
the
the
129.
129,
So
but that is
so let me-
equalized as
Yeah, so
well.
let me take you back to this table.
I'm not disagreeing with
Let me
you.
take you back to the table on page 2. So that we've only been talking about the first two lines.
Exactly.
Correct.
Only the first two.
Right.
Correct.
But I just wanted to add
Yeah.
that as part of that 129 million, the 31 is equalized. In addition, the 16 million is redistributed.
Sure.
Correct.
Correct. Would
Yeah.
not dispute that at all. Absolutely.
It's just two different types of equalization.
Exactly.
Right. And the phrase I was intending to use and didn't use correctly was the 16 million is what's redistributed.
Okay.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that there's more than that that is equalized. It's the 16 million that is redistributed equalization.
Thanks.
I appreciate you letting me sit in. I know the chart much better. I'm not trying to make your lives more complicated. So let me give you one more political consideration to think about. And believe me, I understand all the political considerations everyone's talked about now. Here's, I have heard that there's two separate bills coming forward, and I've heard there's one. I've heard that one bill is putting the sales tax back on food and adding a sales tax to a gallon of gasoline and all the tax changes, and another bill is educational funding. And then I've heard, well, it's all going to be one bill. And I spoke with one Republican heading out to the parking garage last night. They said, well, they did something the last two times they met. When they talked about tax reform, they broke up the Republican House caucus into 4 groups. And one member of leadership took each of 4 groups. So they broke them up. Instead of having 59 people in a room, they had 15, 15, 15, and 15. I said, well, how did it come out to you? What did you see? And he was much more positive about the education funding, about all the rest. They may roll the education. Is this so good that it should not be lost? If it is, I don't know that it is. If it is, the argument might be to the speaker and the leadership team, separate this and cut it off from the sales tax on food argument and pass this and get something done that you want done. That could be a legacy for fixing or making a better attempt at doing some things that we've done in a long time. But maybe not, I don't know. I mean, that's for, and I'm being told that the school board, USBA is behind it and the USSA is behind it. That's what I'm being told. And that just could be log rolling. It could just, and
I like that phrase. That
Yeah, well, these conversations are to get to what you just said is the conclusion. We don't know.
and I got a mailer yesterday. How many of you got the mailer in your mail yesterday about how the legislature wants to write an $80 million check to us? I got the mailer.
I didn't know that 75% of it, or 75 million of it's already funded from last year's dollars. That's interesting. That's a-
I know that.
Can I ask another question just to understand?
Thank you for letting me sit.
Just a clarification.
Yes, please.
So when you come up with the revenue on the revenue side from the property tax,
I think if they think
so that's multiplied by everybody's voted for in capital. So then doesn't school district's effort then come into that as well? So then there's going to be some school districts that are putting in more based on those current rates that they have, based on whatever choices that they've made. And I was trying to remember, because did you say then that will be the number that's always used? Did I hear you say that or no?
So for this scenario, the numbers that we're using right now are the numbers. It doesn't mean that that's what will actually happen.
Yeah.
But it's given us the concept, if you took the concept and tried to put something to it. So this proposal does not try to rectify any historical tax levying efforts and their consequences. This is not trying to fix the past. So don't look at it in that context. This is
Trying to understand.
to just take today and move us forward. Is someone advantaged because of that? Probably. Is someone disadvantaged? Probably, but we're not even trying to rectify that. This is give us today moving forward. However, we do want to make sure that the changes made locally don't influence this
Going
inappropriately.
Yeah.
That's going to be a trick. I don't know.
Yeah.
Wow.
So one thing I think is important for everyone to understand when we're talking about how I understand what it showed us here with regards to the equalization. Nobody likes the idea of robbing Peter to pay Paul. So to make this work, everyone needs to understand Peter never had this money to start with. So I'm giving you a bag of money, but you're gonna have to share some of that with everybody else. And I don't have such a problem if I look at it that way.
It's money you never
If
had.
it's money they never had. So if I'm talking to, Park City, for instance, or Ogden, I'm in the same boat, or any of us, but let's speak, it probably is no less palatable, but the fact that you received a much bigger bag than everybody else in the give, gets lost in the fact that everybody ends up with the same in the end.
I think the
Yeah,
school
well,
board
the
can
school
live with it, it's
district-
the constituents that,
Yeah,
Well-
the school district didn't have the money, but the taxpayers had it in their wallet.
yeah.
And so there is a whole other conversation that I'm hearing about that is taxpayer equity discussion.
Right.
Because that's not in here.
Right.
It's a
And,
different.
and it's got some other champions. So no, that's out there.
Correct.
So I appreciate what you're saying, because I think there are a number of superintendents that think the very same way as, hey, we're all better off, and some of you are helping the rest of us to be better off. Why would we be opposed to helping everybody work together? But the challenge that I have, and I'm not arguing from a Park City's
The bigger
perspective.
that bag, the harder it is to give up.
Well, it's not even that. If you take a look at these orange bars, or whatever color we want to call them, and I made this statement in one of our meetings, are we under the impression that a Millard or an Emory or a Carbon, a Murray, okay, do we think that those are communities who ought to be taking a bigger bag in and walking out with a smaller one? Is that, when we talk about equalization among ourselves, are they the districts that we're thinking about in our minds? Usually there's some different, at least when I've been in a conversation, it's been different school districts. So when I look at this model, I say, are we getting to where we are talking the need for equalization to exist? It's great that the Senate wants to have equalization. And I even asked, what do you mean by equalization? And all I got was equal. Everyone should get the same. It's like, well, that's not helping us here. I appreciate the sentiment, but it's not helping us. So when I look at this, it's like, I think we have some opportunity to define maybe equalization that makes sense, or at least I'm calling it making sense. Because I see districts up here that I don't think I would have chosen as ones that would participate. I'm going back to conversations I had with Senator Fillmore when he was running his equity pupil unit thing through, and I was running scenarios saying, Senator, here's 5 districts that it makes no sense that they're recipients under the principles we discussed this day. It made no sense. And so I pushed on that and said, here are the districts in the meetings we've been at that we have talked about are the ones that should be the beneficiary of this program. Let's tweak the formula to get, no, we're not, this is just easy, straight math, and it is what it is. And it's like, hey, we got districts that should have been in that aren't, and ones that are in that I don't know that anyone would be first in line to say that's the right one in.
So,
So,
you're trying not to speak for Park City. I'll speak for Murray and Canyons. We made a huge, massive local effort last year to increase teacher salaries because we felt that's what was needed. Now, perpetually, forever and ever, we are going to be penalized because we made that effort. And we felt that that was important for our community.
Yep.
So now our community not only gets that tax increase, but they get
this thing,
this on top of it, in which we likely will be a contributing district for
who knows
a
how long.
long time.
Yeah.
So to me, that's not equitable.
So would you advocate doing it on the basic rate? So, I mean, how would you
I mean,
deal with it?
that's not a bad idea, because at least everybody's being assessed on the same tax rate. Because this is based on what? The
Yeah.
voted board capital, right? So, yeah, I mean, based on a tax rate that everybody is assessing, not, I mean, the same level tax rate, not here. Because some districts have made a lot more
Here's
effort,
my-
and now we're getting penalized for it.
So an option then, if the basic rate isn't an option, what if the legislature created a new levy, a property tax equalization levy?
So
They
that,
can call it a local levy if they want.
Yeah, but if you don't have a local effort to set the rate, it's still a legislative thing. So, but
Well, I get it.
another way to go is the way I was trying to explain it, which confused people, is that instead of building it off as a indexing of your current rates, you build the target off of assessed valuations.
Yeah.
And you can tag it on to whatever levy you want to. Create a new one if you want, or you can
Right.
stick it wherever you want.
that's the bottom line. The assessed value per student is the issue.
Correct. So tie it
So,
to
so
that,
don't,
not
so
to
let's
the
not tie it
efforts.
to our local efforts.
Totally. So that's in my head, and that's
I vote
why I
for that.
probably confused you when I was trying to answer what's in that column. I was describing what I think it would be better as opposed to what it's really doing. But that's,
I
I
understand what
apologize
Rich is
for that.
saying. In a district like Nebo, a district like Davis, when you all went to 50, we can't get to 50. We increased our taxes as well. We went through TNT, and we got to barely just under 44.
Mhm.
I don't have the capacity to get to 50. So equalization is the only way we can stay competitive, even in the same ballpark as the Canyons or the Rams.
And so now we're talking big levers. So we've defined equalization in terms of tax yield and WPU. Are those the only two measures that we would ever use to discover equalization? We're locked into just one kind of a
Correct.
formula, all of them.
And Todd's done a good job of articulating, that was some of the superintendent conversation, there's more to equalization than those couple of levers, there's a lot more to it.
But yeah, so that's my spiel. Appreciate Rich being here. But for those who are hanging on or maybe hanging up,
Yeah.
just a final comment is there are some resources out there if you want to have some ideas on how to have the conversation with your superintendent and board. Because again, one of the purposes today was to get you informed enough to be able to explain it to your board so that you can elicit from them responses, ideas, criticisms, etc. We want to have this dialogue and feedback. So hopefully you understand it well enough now that you can have that kind of a conversation. Superintendent Schofield up in Logan made a presentation Tuesday night to his board. He has a pretty cool PowerPoint. If you go out, you might want to take a look at that. It takes the 2 hours we spent and gets it down to about 20 minutes. It's a pretty good presentation. I haven't looked for it. I know it exists. I saw it. But I would, talk to Logan if you want to see that PowerPoint. Of course, the last couple of pages will be Logan specific. It's taken the last. I have my presentation. I don't have it written down, but if you want to listen to it.
Two other summary comments, because
Yeah.
again, people may start peeling off. We're not exactly sure which of two timelines we need to be on. So we've taken, and Todd and I have validated this with USBA because we really are taking direction from them. We're okay to be on the slower timeline in talking with boards about this, which is a timeline presuming that this will be discussed in the regular legislative timeline. And if that's the case, then you can have conversations with your boards of education on the normal cadence of board meeting. In other words, don't call a special work session or anything. And that's the one we're asking you to follow right now. Just like, hey, sometime in the next 6 weeks, review this with your school board so that we're prepared to give responses on the regular legislative session. However, The other timeline that might hit us is that they choose to call a special session. Now, Representative Briscoe already talked to this. If the special session is just on tax reform and they choose to not include education in the special session, then that's why we're okay to be on that more judicious timeline. If they choose to call a special session and they choose to include this in the special session, then we're going to be on a much more emergent timeline. If that's the case, then USBA might be pushing things out to superintendents and business administrators saying, if you haven't talked with your board already, you got to get them in. Because really for anything to change, you know, he said, what's your official position? Well, there's no official position out of the delegate assembly because the official position was set in the delegate assembly. So I think what would have to happen is if leading up to a special session, they wanted an official position out of the constituencies we represent, USBA would probably have to call a special delegate assembly to have a conversation on this and to take official positions. And what USBA doesn't want is a whole bunch of board members showing up to a delegate assembly totally blind to this, having never heard conversation at all. So just, we may need to be nimble, I guess is what I'm saying. But if we need to be, USBA will tell us we need to be, and we just need to have that in the back of our mind that we've got to be responsive quicker perhaps than what our normal cadence of board.
So is there the ability to change this thought process to view equalization differently, or are we marching down the road with this?
Well, I think we'll give them, we'll give them feedback as we have opportunity to give them feedback. I don't think we didn't want, again, that goes back to my first comment. This wasn't intended just to be a sales pitch. This was intended to have you informed, make sure, same with the superintendent, so you're informed. We'll take all the feedback we have, and at every opportunity we have to provide feedback to bill writers and policymakers, we'll absolutely give them the feedback. And just like, and that's the other thing I should have said up front. We've stated all along, hey, listen, we don't know where our constituencies are going to be. We've worked really hard to not lock in where business administrators, school board members, or superintendents would be. And the phrase we've used all along to leadership is, well, how do you know how your 104 are going to fall out on this? We don't know any better on where our 250 are going to fall out or 300 are going to fall out than you know where your 104 are going to fall out. So that's why we're very much in the mode, and they are in the mode right now of just seeking feedback, and I'm sure it'll have to have some adjustments made.
So, like, was yesterday or day before, I was reading the Deseret News.
Yeah.
They were talking to the House Speaker, and he was talking about silent discussions with the education community that they hope to have something going here in the next couple of weeks. So I think we have to ask ourselves, are we better off under the current scenario
With the known evils.
with the known evils,
Sure.
or are we gonna do this? Here's kind of what it feels like to me. Having gone through what happened in 95, 96, this story sounds so much the same. You're gonna be so much better off. And the analogy I use is, you don't know it, but we're gonna hang you, but we will let you choose your rope. Are we gonna end up with more or less? The whole idea behind
Less
this,
rope?
money, we're talking money.
Well, longer rope would be better.
Yeah, you'd like,
you're tall
you'd like for your feet to hit the ground if you're gonna get hung, right? So, but the reality is, like, I brought this up when Phil came to USBA, or well, both things the other day.
And that was so long ago.
You know, you got the income tax, you got the general fund, and you got the transportation fund. And the reality is, there isn't enough in either of them. There isn't enough in either of them. But what they're proposing to do is to put more into the general fund and into the transportation fund at the expense of what's in the income tax fund.
Yes.
And the reason they feel like they can do that is because they're completely satisfied with the level of funding that they've been given education. In fact, they probably are wishing they didn't have so much there to give us. And so if we can get education to buy into this guarantee, which is less than we've been giving them forever, then they've acquiesced and they've agreed to this. I really, in my own mind, have a hard time thinking, how can we be any worse off
Leaving it alone.
leaving alone? And so what if they go back and say, we're gonna reboot the whole thing with higher ed and say that they're now fully funded out of the public ed fund or out of the general fund and do that again? Maybe they should own that is how they feel about it.
It would be nice, in my opinion, that it would be apparent what level of growth will they allow public education to grow at. There is sentiment that government grows too fast, and they have a revenue stream that's growing way faster than they're comfortable with.
Right.
We've seen over 2 decades management of that growth because they don't want a certain growth pattern to be in place. Whether it's the constitutional amendment, whether it's tax reform in the 2005, whatever that was, it's income tax is just generating more money for them to do. We put truth in taxation to retard the growth of property tax in the formula. Well, they didn't do it right because they only grabbed 2 workforces and they held on to one and the other one went. And so they're totally out of whack between income tax and property. It's out of whack.
We would
Totally
love
out of
to
whack.
be able to index, or we'd love to have those property tax indexes so that it said, we don't have to go through truth and taxation if we keep up with that
Yeah. But again,
CPI, but I don't want to have to increase it.
but just
necessarily.
without knowing what's the palatable growth rate for public education, we're all just, flapping in the wind.
It goes back to,
It's- And they won't commit themselves. I'm sorry, I'm speaking for people that I probably shouldn't be, but I don't think they're gonna commit themselves to something we have assumed that, if there's more income tax dollars coming in, it's all gonna come and we're gonna be better off. I mean, we're in a delusion. That's what's never gonna happen. And this is an unspoken thing. I spent enough time in the state government to know, I've heard it directly in that context, not so much in public ed. But there's a growth rate. They don't want government to grow any faster than a certain number. The revenue coming to public ed is growing too fast. I mean, if you go look at Tuesday night's reports, it's growing at 8%. It's above target by 2%. They've got too much money in the sense of we're not going to put more into government services. It's too much money. They're going to give it back because it's too much money. Not our argument that we're so far behind in funding that we need every dollar that will ever get generated. That's not the context. That, Zane, is I think what we're really up against. Whatever mechanism it is, like you can see here, they use change CPI to retard the CPI calculation. It wasn't because they wanted to give us some bigger number. It was that prevalent understanding of controlled government growth is totally in play. It's totally in play, unspoken. You will not have a debate on that. Yeah, so we're trying to put into the Constitution something that they won't even talk openly about, but it's apparent in their actions. That's hard.
So are we going to be better off? That's the question.
And I think and I don't know, we have an answer. That's a question to ask.
Where you are.
Because you don't know where we're gonna go.
well,
Well,
I mean,
that
but-
too.
the bottom line is, if we stay where we are, they simply cut the income tax rate.
Right.
I mean,
We're gonna
period.
do that
I mean,
anyway.
Which gets to, there's a prescribed growth amount that's acceptable, and you control the fountain at the head. It never makes it into the fund to have a discussion. We really can't argue for money that doesn't exist. They have
They've stated what's acceptable by what they propose.
I think that's a pretty good indication of what the limit is. It's less than 2%.
And are the people who are gonna get the money back from the income tax? It's different people, but this is gonna affect.
Well, totally.
Oh, yeah.
But that's why you're hearing this conversation of taxpayer equity. So someone's trying to figure that out. Oh, if you increase sales tax here and you decrease income tax here, is that even the same person? What's the income taxpayer equity in this story? And then throw this on top of it. And now you're gonna add a new dimension of property tax into the conversation.
And to me, you're getting, I love this conversation because it articulates the parallel conundrum that education's got and the legislature's got. In some regards, there's a lot of hands that were dealt where we're sitting here holding a 2 and a 3, right? But the flip side of it is that isn't every hand. I mean, they don't have the upper hand on us on everything, I guess is what I'm saying. There's so many elements of this where they have to have us in order to accomplish what they want, but we don't hold all the cards. And I don't know the interplay in all of that. I can't even articulate what the challenge is.
What if we all just set, what if the delegate assembly were to just sit back and say, we take no position on this?
Well, we already have a statement.
Yes.
We just reconfirmed the statement.
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, and saying that's actually what I've been arguing for a few
and
weeks
let
now.
them own it, so we don't have to.
Well, that's what I've been
Say I
arguing
pick
for
my-
a few weeks is we shouldn't take a position until we absolutely are at a point where when we've talked through the scenario, that we've come to a conclusion on a certain position is the best position to be in. So I'm right where you're at. I'm not, in fact, that's why we're on the slower timeline. I'm saying, and USBA agrees, this makes it sound like it's just me, but that the safest position is when this gets unveiled next Monday, that we shouldn't have an official position when this gets unveiled on Monday.
We can't be in a situation where they say,
Correct.
here's our proposal and we have the support of the education.
Correct.
Well, until you see the language.
Correct.
You really can take a position.
Yeah,
Correct.
or the constitutional language.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, how do you have a position?
I just want to know what happened to the legislators we had 7 or 8 years ago that combined all the levies because they wanted to simplify school finance.
Yeah.
Where did they go?
Yeah. Exactly. This is more complicated. But all we're trying to do is be positioned though, that it may well get to a point where USB, I know it's all, to me, it's USBA leadership where they're saying, you know what? We're now at a point where we have to have a position. We either have to reaffirm that the position that we've got right now is where we're gonna stay and have a discussion on, and if we stay where we're at, we gotta be all in on where we're at and know what the pros and cons of that are to the best of our knowledge, or contemplate having a discussion on, do we need to change our position? And if we need to change our position, then what are the pros and cons to the best of our knowledge that would be in play with a new position, and just have to grapple with that. And then this is where I'm at. You guys know how it is because we're paid to do this with our school boards, right? Then once a position is taken, I'm all in on whatever the position is. If it's to support some version of this, and that's where the delegate assembly lies, I'm going to be all in on it. If they decide they want to storm the Bastille and say, nope, we're all in on fighting tooth and nail to keep the constitutional language exactly like it is, then I'll be all in on that. Ego's not wrapped up in one or the other. And part of it is I don't know what the right place to be is at this point in time. I think we've got to have some really robust discussions.
I keep going back to Zane's comment at the outset, talking about where do we want to end up?
Yeah.
You know, it's been said that where there is no vision, the people perish, right?
Right.
So internally, the legislature has some kind of a growth rate that they don't want to go above for either state government or for public education. Well, what is our stated goal, long-term, 10, 15, 20 years down the road? Where do we want to be? How do we articulate that? How do we have the discussion to try and meld the two? So how do we have any kind of assurances in this proposal that protect us in the long term, instead of saying, I mean, we talk about generating more revenue for education. We've already generated more revenue for education. They're not allocating more revenue for education.
Well-
So how do we bridge
Richard,
that?
that's the whole key in contemplating constitutional replacement language. To me, we've got a constitutional revenue statement. I would like to see a constitutional distribution statement.
Appropriations.
Appropriation is the better word. You always correct me on that. But a constitutional appropriation statement.
We
And
don't.
to me, there's two key tenets to all of this, right? The two key tenets are growth and inflation. And we ought to be able to get something that talks about growth and inflation in relation to a, what's the word?
Appropriation.
Appropriation. We need to have a constitutional guarantee that there is an appropriation that takes into account growth and inflation. And that's the shortest way I can say it,
No.
right?
And that's
So
about
to-
as far as you can get in the Constitution.
In the Constitution.
But that would be okay.
Correct. So that's 100% what we're trying to angle for on language now, is an appropriation guarantee related to growth and inflation.
So if we don't protect the future
Correct.
and rely on the goodwill of the legislature, we
Yeah.
fail.
Right, and that's why I say we've absolutely got that flag in the ground. And Richard, back to, and Zane even said it, I mean, I've not so jokingly continued to say, get us to 40th. Right? But at a minimum, what we've got to have, because they're not going to declare 40th as our target. But we sure need to have something modeled that's got an upward trajectory line where we can sit there and say, well, gosh, in 4 years, we're actually at 49th. If this model plays out and we have the constitutional guarantee on growth and inflation. Oh, wow. In 11 years, we're at 48. Oh, gee, in 15 years, they've got us to 47. Now, again, that doesn't control what every other state's doing with their allocations, but at least we've got to have an upward trajectory.
So here's a suggestion for consideration.
Yeah.
Why don't, think about drafting language to that effect.
Yeah.
To bring it down to the assembly. This whole equalization discussion.
Oh, sure.
Is gonna,
You mean constitutional language
yes,
for growth and inflation?
yes.
But exclude.
If you, no, let's try to keep this whole discussion, the discussion for another day with legislators. We can talk about what's good about that. But I don't think when you have a delegate assembly, if we're trying to come to consensus on that, you're not gonna do it. I just don't see it happening.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about,
Sure.
really the whole thing is about, do we want to get on board with a change in the Constitution?
Sure.
As it stands right now, short of what you just described,
No way.
hell no,
Correct.
okay? However,
Yeah.
if they would buy into that language so that we got that,
Correct.
I think maybe that's something we could have a good discussion about.
Sure.
And maybe to come to consensus on that one right there, we've got to have a lot more discussion about.
Well, your two biggest hurdles on this document are equalization and the fact that the entire basis is based on property tax,
Well,
right?
Right.
Yeah.
it's based on property tax and putting it on the local boards
Sure.
to own it.
Correct.
I think the biggest challenge we have, if you're looking at this, we're used to the blue and green.
Correct.
Everybody knows about that. We live that our whole
Correct.
life. It's the orange and the light blue at the top. That's a new
Correct.
concept for us.
Other than unbeknownst to a lot of people, that's what TSSA just did.
Right.
Correct.
It is.
I
We
fought
had the
it, I
same
fought it,
discussion.
but I was like the lone soldier because
Yeah.
it's like.
What is your guys' perception of, I'm
This
curious
is
about,
legalization unlabeled.
Curious about your guys' perception is, let's say the legislature wants to go down this road, we don't want to go down that road, and we do a vouchers. That happened 12 years ago, and ultimately we defeat it.
Mhm.
We paid a little bit of a price after we defeated vouchers for a few years. What's your perception? How would the legislature react if they went their way, we went ours, and we ended up defeating it? I'm just curious.
What's your gut on that?
They'll just cut the tax rate.
But
Which are they gonna do anyway? So it's like,
And
And that goes to my analogy. This is the arena in which they hold all the cards and we hold none of them.
I don't know that we'd be any worse off though.
And that's what Zane's posing. I don't know that would be worse off, but I think my perception is they have really, really long memories. And so,
They have to be careful, don't you think? Because I think voters are getting more keen on some things. And we need to do a better job of educating our voters on what's going on, like you're talking about.
listening on
Vote.
Monday morning.
So help us get out of the MSP.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
Wow.
exactly, yeah.
seceding from the union.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not the first time we've had the conversation.
Yeah.
Different board members,
You know?
same board asked the same
To
question
go
7
back-
years ago.
To go maybe a little deeper on what you're posing, I think what we've got to do is if we choose to not be supportive of something like this, we've got to have a really thoughtful strategy on how we move forward, that it's not that we just storm the Bastille.
No.
And that's where superintendent, in answer to his question too, that's kind of where superintendent started to get to. It's like, well, okay, we're starting to at least see some things that make sense and we get where you're going and we understand the foundational principles. We might have some disagreements on, the mechanics of it or things like that, but we're getting that. But in some regards, we got to be super judicious to not have it come across that all we did was simply drop that in the round file. And the other response is, come heck or high water, all we're doing is fighting to retain the constitutional language on income tax.
They could fund that with income tax. They
Sure.
don't need-
Correct.
This whole proposal could fit within the current
Correct.
constitutional language. with
Correct.
No changes,
Correct.
but that doesn't help them on
That doesn't give them their
Correct.
flexibility.
In order to get all of this, we need to, in their assessment, we need to
Correct.
give up on income tax.
Which is why they keep coming back to us and saying it's a package deal. Yeah, because.
Another thing, going back to my previous comment, is, let's grow the economy, let's increase state revenues, let's increase income tax as well. Part of that equation is RDA's, tax increment financing. You guys support this, long-term, it'll be better for the economy, we'll bring new companies in, you'll get more property tax, we'll get more income tax. And we see what happens with that. So, again, we need to have some type of vision, some type of goal, protection somehow. I know that that's difficult to do, but that we need to have that speaking.
This is what I say. I say that the new constitutional language has to guarantee that bar chart goes into effect. But whatever was there last year, including growth and inflation, is locked in next year. That's the bar chart that I keep saying needs to be explained in a constitutional amendment. Because other than that, you're right, it's a total roll of the dice where we are every
We
single
could
year.
go get on the same page on that.
Correct,
Maybe we could go for a change in the constitution.
correct.
Clarification. So on the property tax piece then, with the voted board and capital levies, just to make sure, because I got a question here. So right now, rates increase, property values increase, rates decrease. That's not gonna happen now. Or is that gonna
Well,
happen?
that will, so the certified rate process will still be in play. So will local decision-making on your rate. This indexing.
Thank you very much.
Is based on
I
a
better
current,
take off.
thank you. Is based on a current.
Thanks, guys. I'm assuming any questions you have at this point.
Any other two factors.
I have no idea.
How that all.
Thank you for.
So,
That was very helpful.
so we could.
Very
we could-
helpful.
Thank you. Good insight.
Thanks, Rick.
That was extremely helpful.
Very helpful.
So we could game the system and say, well, we'll get more equalization because we reduce our tax rates by X amount.
The intent is to.
How do you?
But then we'll
Like
take
like
it,
I've been saying,
right.
we understand the concept that the writing of the statute to prohibit that behavior is really difficult. Unless you tie this thing to something that's.
And what's
And you still brought property tax,
Still
which is-
drunk.
And what's interesting is, I really appreciate what you said about those school districts and whether or not they should have been included. Because I think the reason they are is because their tax rate is.
I don't know, my deeper impression is that you might have a high tax rate, but it's because you have so few students.
And that too.
It-
Yeah,
it's-
exactly.
All of our thinking in our equalization formulas is totally yield, tax yield, and WPU.
Yeah.
It's some combination of the two. Those are not the only levers in the world.
Right.
But that's what I default to because that's what the basic levy is premised on. What the guarantees are premised on. So we're familiar with it. We just, oh, let's do
Right.
some more of it. It's like, well, that's.
So let's use a fixed tax rate for everybody. That will show the true yield based on valuation. Otherwise, it's not a true. It's not a true picture of what's going on.
Totally. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's. For 10 more minutes. I don't know how to turn it off. So all of you who are still hanging in there, we're done. You're free to go. Please, if you have ideas or comments, send it my way and I'll make sure it gets into the USDA feedback loop. Thanks for your time today.